The summer sun beat down on Red Hollow's bride platform like it had a personal grudge. Mara Holloway stood at the far edge, her worn carpet bag sitting in the dirt beside her dusty boots, watching another selection unfold the way they always did, without her. She'd stopped counting the glances that slid past her face, stopped measuring the seconds men's eyes stayed on her before moving to someone younger, thinner, prettier. At 32 years old and carrying more weight than any man west of the Mississippi seemed willing to accept, Mara had become an expert in being overlooked. This was her 8th time on a bride platform, 8th time traveling by stage and rail to some frontier town that promised opportunity and delivered humiliation. 8th time standing in the sun while men circled like buyers at a livestock auction, examining teeth and disposition, asking questions about cooking and childbearing, their eyes always settling on the slender girls with small waists and hopeful smiles. "Miss Holloway?" A thin voice broke through her thoughts. Mara turned to find Sarah Mitchell, one of the younger brides, standing nearby. Sarah couldn't have been more than 19, with blonde curls that caught the light like spun gold, and a figure that made men trip over their own boots. She'd been selected within an hour of arriving in Red Hollow 2 days ago by a shopkeeper with kind eyes and nervous hands. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say," Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper, "I think it's brave that you keep trying." The words hit like a slap disguised as kindness. Mara's throat tightened, but she managed a smile that felt like broken glass in her mouth. "Thank you, Sarah. Brave. That's what people called it when you refused to accept that the world had no place for you. When you kept showing up even though every arrival proved what you already knew, that women like her weren't wanted." The platform had cleared considerably since morning. Of the 15 women who'd arrived on Tuesday's stage, only 4 remained. The pretty ones had gone first, claimed by ranchers and merchants, and even a traveling dentist who'd chosen a petite brunette with a laugh like wind chimes. Then the moderately pretty ones. Then the plain but young ones. Now there was Mara, and 3 others who carried their own particular brands of frontier undesirability. Judith, who was 47 and had buried 3 husbands. Catherine, who walked with a pronounced limp from childhood illness. And Agnes, whose face bore the pitted scars of survived smallpox. "Ladies!" Reverend Michaels climbed onto the platform's center boards, his face flushed from the heat and from something that looked like embarrassment. "I believe we can conclude today's selection. The remaining gentlemen have indicated they'll wait for next month's arrivals." Of course they would. Why settle for the leftovers when fresh prospects were always coming? Mara felt the familiar burn of shame crawling up her spine, but she'd learned to carry it like everything else she hauled, with her back straight and her face empty of complaint. That means you're free to make arrangements for return passage or to seek employment in town. The Reverend couldn't quite meet their eyes. "Mrs. Colbert at the boarding house has expressed willingness to offer temporary lodging at reduced rates while you consider your options. Your options." As if they had any. Return east to families who'd been relieved to see them go? Stay in a town that had already declared them unwanted? Mara had played this scene before in other towns. She knew exactly how it ended, with women like her taking whatever work was available, usually laundry or cleaning, slowly disappearing into the background of frontier life until they became invisible fixtures. Spinster aunts, charity cases, warnings to younger girls about the dangers of aging without a husband. "Miss Holloway?" Mara turned to find Reverend Michaels standing closer than comfortable, his voice low enough that the other women couldn't hear. "I took the liberty of speaking with Mrs. Colbert about your particular situation. She's willing to offer you permanent employment as a laundress. The wages are modest, but the room and board are included, and the work is steady." Permanent employment. Translation: you're done trying. Time to accept your place. Something hot and defiant flared in Mara's chest. "That's very kind, Reverend, but I haven't decided my plans yet." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Miss Holloway, I say this with Christian concern. You've been here 3 days. The men who came looking for brides have made their choices. Waiting longer won't change the outcome." "Perhaps not." Mara kept her voice level despite the anger building behind her ribs. "But I'll make that determination myself." The Reverend's mouth compressed into a thin line. He nodded curtly and moved away to speak with Agnes, leaving Mara alone with her defiance and her carpet bag and the certainty that she was being foolish. But she'd been foolish before. What was one more day? The afternoon dragged on. One by one, the other women made their decisions. Judith accepted work at the boarding house. Catherine agreed to teach piano lessons to the schoolmaster's daughters. Agnes, who'd apparently been corresponding with a widower in a neighboring town, arranged passage on tomorrow's stage. By sunset, Mara stood alone on the platform. The town had moved on. Shopkeepers closed their doors. Families retreated to their homes for supper. Even the dogs had found shadier places to sleep. She should go to the boarding house, should accept Mrs. Colbert's offer and stop pretending this time would be different. But something stubborn in her refused to move. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe after 7 rejections, she'd simply run out of the capacity to surrender gracefully. The sun hung low and orange over the western hills when Mara heard it. Hoofbeats. Fast ones. Coming hard from the north road. She turned, shading her eyes against the glare. A single rider emerged from the dust, mounted on a massive bay horse that looked like it had been running for miles. The rider sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered and dust-covered, moving with the kind of easy confidence that came from being comfortable with both horse and land. The horse and rider thundered into Red Hollow's main street, scattering chickens and drawing stares from the few people still outside. The rider didn't slow until he reached the platform where Mara stood. Up close, she could see he was a man in his early 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples, and a face that looked carved from the same rock as the surrounding hills, all hard angles and weathered plains. His clothes were expensive but worn from use, not neglect. A working man's clothes, but tailored by someone who understood quality. He swung down from the saddle with fluid grace and stood there, studying the empty platform with an expression Mara couldn't read. "I'm looking for the bride selection." His voice was deep and rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. "You missed it." Mara wasn't sure why she spoke, wasn't sure why she didn't just point him toward the Reverend's house and disappear. "Ended this afternoon." The man's gaze shifted to her, and Mara felt the weight of his attention like physical pressure. His eyes were dark, brown or maybe gray, she couldn't tell in the fading light, and they didn't slide past her face the way other men's eyes had. They stayed put, direct and assessing. "You're one of the brides?" "Was." Mara lifted her chin. "I'm one of the ones who wasn't chosen." Something flickered across his face. Not pity. She would have recognized pity. Something closer to interest, though that seemed unlikely. "Names?" he asked. "Excuse me?" "The brides who were selected. I need their names." Mara blinked. "Why?" "Because I need a wife, and I'm hoping none of them were the ones I'm looking for." The blunt statement caught her off guard. Most men approached marriage with at least a pretense of romance or careful consideration. This man talked about needing a wife the way someone might talk about needing a new plow, practical and immediate. Sarah Mitchell was chosen by Thomas Warren, the shopkeeper, Mara heard herself say. Elizabeth Brennan went with a rancher named Samuel Cross. Mary Catherine Doyle accepted a proposal from Tishki Gisanka. None of those. The man cut her off, his expression shifting to something that might have been relief. "The women who weren't chosen, tell me about them." Mara's stomach dropped. Of course. He wanted to know about the others, Judith or Catherine or Agnes, women who'd been passed over but who were still more acceptable than Mara herself. "They've all made other arrangements." The words came out flatter than she intended. "One accepted employment, one's teaching piano, and one left town this evening." The man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on her face with that unnerving directness. "What about you?" "What about me?" "Have you made arrangements?" Mara's throat felt tight. "Not yet." "Why not?" The question was too direct, too invasive. Mara should have walked away, should have told this dust-covered stranger that her business was her own and headed straight to Mrs. Colbert's boarding house before full dark. Instead, she told the truth. "I haven't decided if I'm done yet." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something in that neighborhood. "Done with what?" "Trying." Mara met his eyes squarely, too tired for diplomacy. "I've been to 7 towns before this one. Stood on 7 platforms. Been passed over 7 times. I came here thinking maybe the 8th time would be different. It wasn't. So now I'm standing here trying to figure out if I'm stubborn enough to try a 9th time or smart enough to finally quit." She expected him to make an excuse and leave. Expected the conversation to end the way these conversations always ended, with the man remembering something urgent elsewhere, and Mara standing alone with her honesty hanging in the air like laundry nobody wanted to claim. Instead, the man held out his hand. Gideon Vale. I own Iron Ridge Ranch, about 12 miles north of here. Mara stared at his outstretched hand. In the 3 days she'd been in Red Hollow, she'd heard that name more than once. Iron Ridge was apparently one of the largest spreads in the territory, thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle, and a main house that supposedly put most hotels to shame. Slowly, she took his hand. His grip was warm and calloused, the handshake firm but not crushing. Mara Holloway. Miss Holloway. Gideon Vale didn't release her hand immediately. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. All right. Can you cook for 30 men without burning the beans? Whatever Mara had expected, it wasn't that. Yes. Can you manage household accounts and inventory? Yes. Can you ride a horse? I've ridden before. I'm not particularly graceful about it, but I can stay in the saddle. Can you handle a rifle? Well enough. Gideon nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. One more question. Why do you think you weren't chosen? The question hit like a fist to the chest. Mara yanked her hand back, her face burning. You know why. Do I? Look at me. The words came out sharp with anger and old pain. I'm 32 years old. I'm fat. I'm plain. Men don't choose women like me when there are younger, prettier options available. They never have. They never will. She expected him to look embarrassed, to mumble an apology and climb back on his horse. Instead, Gideon Vale studied her with the same direct, assessing gaze he'd been using since he arrived. I'll make you an offer, Miss Holloway. It's not a proposal, not yet, but it's an opportunity. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. What kind of opportunity? I need a wife. Not for decoration or companionship or romance. I need someone who can run a ranch household, manage supplies, feed crews, and survive frontier life without falling apart at the first hardship. I've been married before. My wife died 3 years ago in childbirth, and the baby with her. Since then, I've tried hiring housekeepers, but none of them lasted more than a few months. The work's too hard, and the isolation breaks them. He paused, letting his words settle in the dusty evening air. I came to this selection hoping to find a woman who could handle Iron Ridge. Not the prettiest woman, or the youngest, or the most charming. Just someone capable and tough enough to survive. From what you've told me, you've survived 7 rejections and traveled alone across half the country multiple times. That tells me you're tougher than most. Mara couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. You're saying you want to marry me because I'm tough? I'm saying I want to start a supervised courtship. That's how we do things in Red Hollow. A month of chaperoned meetings so both parties can decide if the arrangement will work. If at the end of that month you think you can handle life at Iron Ridge, and I think you're suited for it, then we'll discuss marriage. If either of us decides it won't work, you're free to move on with no obligation. Why? The word burst out before Mara could stop it. Why would you choose me when there were a dozen younger, prettier women here 3 days ago? Gideon's expression didn't change. Because young and pretty doesn't survive frontier winters. Because I don't need a decoration. I need a partner. And because 7 rejections means you understand exactly what you're getting into. You've seen how men treat women on these platforms. You know the harsh realities better than any starry-eyed girl fresh from Boston. That makes you valuable, Miss Holloway. More valuable than you apparently realize. Mara felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. Men didn't choose her. They didn't look at her body and see anything except reasons to look elsewhere. The whole conversation felt like a fever dream or a cruel joke. I need to think about it. Of course. Gideon stepped back, giving her space. I'm staying at the Red Hollow Hotel tonight. If you decide you're interested, meet me at Reverend Michael's house tomorrow morning at 9. He handles the courtship arrangements. If you don't show up, I'll understand. No hard feelings either way. He gathered his horse's reins and started to lead the animal toward the stable. Then he paused and looked back at Mara, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. For what it's worth, Miss Holloway, those 7 men who didn't choose you were fools. Their loss might be my gain. Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows between buildings, leaving Mara alone on the platform with her carpet bag and a choice that felt too impossible to be real. She stood there until full dark, her mind spinning. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? A chance, an opportunity, someone willing to see past her body to whatever else she might offer. So why did it feel so much like another elaborate rejection waiting to happen? Because it was too practical, maybe. Too transactional. Gideon Vale had made it clear he wasn't offering love or romance or even basic attraction. He needed a workhorse, not a wife. Someone to cook and clean and manage his enormous ranch without expecting anything resembling affection in return. But wasn't that better than nothing? Better than returning east defeated or fading into invisible spinsterhood in Red Hollow? At least at Iron Ridge, she'd have purpose. Work that mattered. A place that needed her, even if the man offering it didn't want her. Mara picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the boarding house, her thoughts churning. Mrs. Colbert was sweeping the front porch when she arrived, and her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Miss Holloway, I wasn't certain you'd come." "I'd like to take that room, if the offer's still available." Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Just for tonight. I'll know my plans by morning." Mrs. Colbert studied her face with the sharp eyes of a woman who'd seen her share of frontier drama. "That man who rode in at sunset, was that Gideon Vale?" "Yes." "And did he speak with you?" "Yes." "I see." Mrs. Colbert stepped aside to let Mara enter. "In that case, the room is yours for tonight. No charge. Consider it an investment in local gossip. I want to hear everything that happens next." Mara managed a weak smile. "I'll try to provide good material." Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over Red Hollow's main street. Mara set her carpet bag on the floor and sat on the bed, her body finally registering the exhaustion of 3 days standing in the sun waiting to be chosen. She should sleep, should rest and think clearly about Gideon Vale's offer. Instead, she found herself replaying their conversation, examining every word for hidden mockery or cruelty, but there hadn't been any. His tone had been direct, almost businesslike. He'd asked practical questions and offered a practical solution. No false promises, no pretense of attraction, just an honest assessment of what he needed and what he thought she could provide. Was that enough? Could she marry a man who saw her as a ranch manager instead of a wife? Who valued her ability to cook for 30 men more than anything about her as a person? Mara lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The truth was, she'd given up on being valued as a person years ago. 7 rejections had taught her that her person, her heart, her mind, her hopes, didn't matter as much as her appearance, and her appearance had already been judged and found wanting. So maybe Gideon Vale's offer was actually more honest than most. At least he wasn't pretending. At least he wasn't making false promises about love and affection while secretly comparing her to thinner women. He'd laid out the terms plainly, capability in exchange for a place to belong. The question was whether Mara could live with those terms, whether she could build a life on practical necessity instead of affection, whether she was brave enough or desperate enough to take the chance. She didn't sleep much that night. When dawn broke over Red Hollow, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink, Mara was already awake. She washed her face in the basin, pinned up her hair as neatly as she could manage, and put on her best dress, a dark blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable. In the small mirror above the washstand, she studied her reflection. Round face, soft chin, body that strained the seams of her dress. The woman who looked back at her was the same woman 7 men had rejected. The same woman who'd spent her entire adult life being told she took up too much space. "Well," Mara said to her reflection, "let's see if the 8th time really is different." She walked to Reverend Michael's house, arriving at 5 minutes before 9. The Reverend's wife answered the door, her expression politely curious. "Miss Holloway, how can I help you?" "I'm here to see the Reverend, about a courtship arrangement." Mrs. Michael's eyebrows shot up, but she stepped aside without comment. "He's in his study. I'll let him know you're here." Mara waited in the parlor, her hands twisted together in her lap. Through the window, she could see Red Hollow coming to life. Shopkeepers opening their doors, children running errands, a freight wagon rumbling down the main street. "Miss Holloway." She turned to find Reverend Michaels standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "I understand you're here about a courtship arrangement?" "Yes." with Gideon Vale. The Reverend's neutrality cracked slightly. I see. And you're certain about this? No? Mara met his eyes squarely. But I'm here anyway. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Mr. Vale arrived 15 minutes ago. He's waiting in my study. If you'll come with me, we'll discuss the terms. Mara followed him down a narrow hallway to a book-lined study where Gideon Vale stood looking out the window. He'd cleaned up since last night. His hair was damp from washing, and he wore fresh clothes that fit his broad frame perfectly. When he turned, his expression showed neither surprise nor satisfaction at her arrival. Just that same direct assessment she was starting to recognize. Miss Holloway. He inclined his head slightly. I'm glad you came. Mr. Vale. Mara's voice came out stronger than she felt. I'd like to discuss your offer. Reverend Michaels gestured for them to sit, then settled behind his desk with the air of a man about to conduct official business. Before we proceed, I need to ensure both parties understand the terms of a supervised courtship. For the next month, Mr. Vale and Miss Holloway will meet regularly under appropriate supervision. At the end of that month, either party may terminate the arrangement without explanation or obligation. If both parties agree to proceed, a marriage will be performed. Are these terms acceptable? Yes, Gideon said. Mara took a breath. Yes. Very well. The Reverend pulled out a ledger and began writing. Mr. Vale, where will Miss Holloway reside during the courtship period? At the boarding house with Mrs. Colbert. I'll cover her expenses. And the supervision arrangements? I'll come to town twice a week for meetings. Mrs. Colbert can chaperone. Reverend Michaels made notes, then looked at Mara. Miss Holloway, do you have any questions or concerns about these arrangements? She had about 100, but one seemed most pressing. What exactly would my responsibilities be if this courtship leads to marriage? Gideon answered before the Reverend could speak. Running the ranch household. That includes managing food supplies and preparation for the main house and bunkhouse, overseeing cleaning and laundry, maintaining household accounts, and handling any correspondence or business matters I delegate to you. During busy seasons, you might also need to help with branding, haying, or other ranch work. You mentioned isolation earlier. How isolated? Iron Ridge is 12 miles from Red Hollow. In good weather, it's a 3-hour ride. In winter, we sometimes go weeks without seeing anyone from town. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. If you're someone who needs constant social interaction, you won't last. His bluntness should have stung, but Mara found it oddly refreshing. I've spent most of my life being excluded from social interaction. I think I can handle the quiet. Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. Then we might get along better than expected. Reverend Michaels cleared his throat. If there are no further questions, I'll formalize the courtship contract. Mr. Vale, Miss Holloway, please sign here. Mara stared at the document in front of her. This was it. The moment where she either committed to this strange practical arrangement or walked away to whatever uncertain future waited. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. Then she thought about 7 platforms, 7 rejections, 7 times being told through silence and averted eyes that she didn't deserve a place. And she thought about Gideon Vale's words last night. Those 7 men who didn't choose you were fools. Maybe he was right. Or maybe he was just another man who'd eventually regret his choice. But either way, Mara was tired of letting other people's rejection define her future. She signed her name in firm, clear letters, Mara Christine Holloway. Gideon signed below hers, his handwriting bold and slanted. Reverend Michaels witnessed both signatures, then handed Mara a copy of the contract. The courtship period begins today and ends 30 days from now. May the Lord guide you both toward wisdom and discernment. Gideon stood, and Mara followed suit. They faced each other awkwardly in the Reverend's study, 2 practical strangers who'd just agreed to spend a month determining if they could build a life together. I'll call on you Wednesday afternoon, Gideon said. 2 o'clock. We can take a walk, and I'll answer any questions you have about Iron Ridge. All right. He nodded once, then left without further ceremony. Mara heard the front door close, then the sound of hoofbeats fading as he rode away. Reverend Michaels stood from his desk. Miss Holloway, I hope you understand what you've undertaken. Gideon Vale is a good man, but he's not an easy one, And frontier life is harsh even for women who've been raised to it. I understand. Mara met his gaze steadily. But being unwanted in comfortable places isn't any easier than being needed in harsh ones. At least at Iron Ridge, I'll have purpose. The Reverend's expression softened slightly. Then I'll pray you find more than just purpose, child. I'll pray you find peace. Mara walked back to the boarding house in a daze. She'd done it, actually signed a courtship contract with a man who'd seen her exactly once and decided she might be tough enough for his ranch. It felt surreal and terrifying and just slightly hopeful in a way she didn't quite trust. Mrs. Colbert was waiting when she arrived, practically vibrating with curiosity. Well, I'm staying for a month. Mr. Vale will cover the expenses. Sweet, merciful heavens. Mrs. Colbert sank into a chair. Gideon Vale chose you for courtship? I need to sit down. I am sitting down. I need to sit down more. Is that shock because of me specifically, or because you didn't think he'd choose anyone? Both? Neither? Mrs. Colbert fanned herself. That man hasn't looked at a woman since his wife died. Everyone assumed he'd stay a widower, and now he's courting the... Forgive me for saying it plainly, but he's courting the one woman nobody else wanted. It's going to cause talk, Miss Holloway. Considerable talk. Mara felt something hard settle in her chest. I'm aware. Are you? Mrs. Colbert leaned forward. Dawson society can be vicious, especially to women who don't fit their expectations. And you courting the wealthiest rancher in the territory while carrying that figure? They'll tear you apart. They've been tearing me apart my whole life. Mara's voice came out flat. At least at Iron Ridge, I'll be too far away to hear it. Mrs. Colbert studied her face, then nodded slowly. You're tougher than you look. You might actually survive this. Come on, let's get you properly settled. If you're going to be here a month, you'll need more than one dress and a pair of worn-out boots. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Colbert, who turned out to have a surprisingly kind heart beneath her gossip-hungry exterior, helped Mara acquire basic necessities. A second dress, sturdy shoes, a proper coat for when autumn arrived. Mara paid for everything from her carefully hoarded savings, aware that she might need every cent if the courtship fell apart. Wednesday arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures that made standing outside feel like punishment. Mara dressed in her better dress and waited on the boarding house porch, her stomach twisted in anxious knots. Gideon arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, riding the same massive bay horse from their first meeting. He dismounted and approached the porch, his expression neutral. Miss Holloway. Mr. Vale. Mrs. Colbert appeared in the doorway, playing her chaperone role with theatrical enthusiasm. I'll be watching from the porch. Don't go farther than shouting distance. They walked toward the edge of town, maintaining a careful foot of space between them. The silence felt awkward, weighted with unspoken questions and mutual uncertainty. Finally, Gideon spoke. You have questions. Ask them. Mara appreciated his directness. Why didn't you choose one of the younger women? Even if you wanted someone practical, several of them seemed capable. They seemed hopeful. Gideon's voice was flat. Young women come west with dreams about frontier romance and adventure. When reality hits, the isolation, the work, the harshness, those dreams break. I've seen it happen. I don't have time or patience to nurse anyone through disillusionment. And you think I won't be disillusioned? I think you already have been, 7 times. You know exactly how cruel life can be. That makes you stronger. Mara wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just another brutal assessment. What happened to your wife? Gideon's jaw tightened. Childbirth. The baby came early and there were complications. Neither of them survived. I'm sorry. It was 3 years ago. The flatness in his voice told Mara more than words could. This was a man who'd learned to carry grief by refusing to examine it too closely. She understood that impulse better than she wanted to. They walked farther, past the last buildings into open scrubland. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky. What do you need from a wife? Mara asked. Besides the practical things you mentioned. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Honesty. Reliability. Someone who won't fold when things get difficult, and they will get difficult. Winter at Iron Ridge can be brutal. We've lost cattle to storms, had supply wagons fail to arrive, gone weeks eating nothing but beans and salt pork because fresh food couldn't get through. I need someone who can handle that without complaint or collapse. What about companionship? What about it? Do you want it? Or is this truly just a business arrangement? He stopped walking and turned to face her, his dark eyes direct and unreadable. I don't know. My first marriage started with affection and ended in grief. I'm not sure I have the capacity for that kind of risk again. But I won't lie to you. Companionship would be welcome. If it develops naturally, I just can't promise it will. The honesty gutted her. Most men would have offered false assurances or pretty words. Gideon Vale just gave her the truth, sharp-edged and uncomfortable. That's fair, Mara said quietly. I can't promise it either. Something shifted in his expression. You've been hurt 7 times. She met his gaze squarely. And those are just the formal rejections. They don't count the years before that when I learned that women like me don't get chosen, don't get courted, don't get loved. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about companionship developing naturally. Gideon studied her face. Then we're both walking into this damaged. That might make it easier or harder. I honestly don't know which. Neither do I. They stood in the scrubland, 2 broken people trying to determine if their particular brands of damage might somehow fit together into something functional. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't even particularly hopeful, but it was honest, and Mara found unexpected comfort in that honesty. I should get you back, Gideon said finally, before Mrs. Colbert decides we've eloped. They walked toward town, the silence between them less awkward than before. At the boarding house steps, Gideon paused. Same time Saturday? All right. He nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Mara on the porch with more questions than answers, but also something that felt dangerously close to hope. The next 3 weeks followed the same pattern. Twice-weekly meetings under Mrs. Colbert's watchful supervision. Walks at the edge of town. Conversations that oscillated between practical and unexpectedly personal. Slowly, Mara began to understand Gideon Vale. His bluntness that came from painful honesty rather than cruelty. His grief that manifested as emotional distance. His fierce protectiveness of Iron Ridge and everyone who worked there. And slowly she began to believe he might actually see her as something other than a last resort. But Red Hollow saw things differently. The gossip Mrs. Colbert had predicted materialized with venomous enthusiasm. Women whispered behind gloved hands about the fat bride who'd somehow snared the territory's richest rancher. Men made jokes in saloons about Gideon needing someone large enough to handle ranch work. The speculation ranged from mildly insulting to vicious, but it all carried the same message. Mara Holloway didn't deserve Gideon Vale's attention. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her twice-weekly meetings and the courtship that was progressing with surprising steadiness. But the weight of judgment pressed down like physical pressure, making her question everything. On the 4th Saturday after their walk, Mara finally broke. Why are you really doing this? Gideon frowned. I've told you why. No, you've told me what you need, but that doesn't explain why you chose me. There must have been other capable women who came through Red Hollow, women who wouldn't cause this kind of talk. Ah, understanding crossed his face. You've heard the gossip. All of it. Mara's voice shook despite her efforts to steady it. They think you're desperate, or blind, or maybe just cruel, that you're playing some elaborate joke before revealing the truth and humiliating me in front of the entire territory. And what do you think? I think I've been rejected enough times to know what it looks like. And this doesn't look like rejection, but it also doesn't make sense. Men don't choose women like me when they have other options. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. My wife was beautiful, small and delicate, and exactly what everyone expected a rancher's wife to be. And she was miserable at Iron Ridge. Hated the isolation, hated the work, hated how hard everything was. She tried, I'll give her that, but frontier life broke her. By the time she got pregnant, I think part of her saw death as an escape. He paused, his jaw working. After she died, I hired housekeepers. All young, all pretty, all worthless. They lasted weeks before running back to town crying about how awful ranch life was. So when I came to Red Hollow looking for a wife, I made a decision. I would choose based on capability alone. No consideration for age or appearance, just pure survival potential. He turned to face Mara squarely. You want to know why I chose you? Because you're still standing. 7 rejections, and you're still trying. That tells me you have something those pretty young women lack, the kind of stubborn toughness that survives when everything else fails. That's what Iron Ridge needs. That's what I need. Mara felt something crack open in her chest. Not hope, not quite, but maybe the possibility of hope. So it's still about capability? Yes, Gideon's voice softened slightly. But capability matters more than you think. My wife was lovely, and I cared for her, and she still couldn't survive our life. You're tough enough to survive. That makes you infinitely more valuable. They walked back to the boarding house in silence. At the porch steps, Gideon paused. The courtship month ends in 1 week. I need your answer then. I know. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you think this won't work, if the gossip is too much, or the reality of Iron Ridge is more than you want, I'll understand. Mara looked at him, this blunt, damaged man who'd somehow seen past her body to something he considered valuable. And if I say yes? Then we get married, and you come to Iron Ridge as my wife, with all the challenges and difficulties that entails. No romance? I told you. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. No promises of affection. Only honesty and respect. That's all I can guarantee. Mara nodded slowly. Then I'll have my answer in a week. She spent the next 7 days wrestling with the decision. Mrs. Colbert, surprisingly, advised her to accept. Romance is overrated, the older woman said. Respect and honesty? Those are the bones of a good marriage. The rest is just decoration. But it was Reverend Michael's wife who gave Mara the perspective she needed. Over tea in the parsonage, Mrs. Michaels spoke quietly about her own marriage. I wasn't my husband's first choice. Did you know that? He proposed to another woman first, a banker's daughter with a substantial dowry. She turned him down because he was just a poor country preacher. So he asked me instead, the spinster school teacher everyone assumed would never marry. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. For the first year, I wondered if he regretted it, if he still thought about that banker's daughter. But over time, I realized something important. It doesn't matter who someone wanted first. What matters is who they choose to build a life with. And my husband chose me. Every day, he chooses me. That's more valuable than any romantic fantasy. Mara went back to the boarding house and sat on her narrow bed, thinking about choices and value and what kind of life she wanted to build. The truth was simple and uncomfortable. She could wait for romance, but romance had never come looking for her. She could hope for affection, but hope hadn't changed anything in 32 years. What Gideon offered wasn't pretty or passionate, but it was real, a place to belong, work that mattered, respect instead of rejection. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was more than enough. Saturday arrived clear and hot. Gideon appeared at 2 o'clock, and Mara met him on the boarding house porch. Mrs. Colbert hovered nearby, but Mara barely noticed her. I have my answer, Mara said without preamble. Gideon's expression was carefully neutral. Go ahead. Yes, I'll marry you. Something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. You're certain? As certain as I can be about something this strange and terrifying. You need someone tough enough for Iron Ridge. I need a place where I'm valued for who I am, not judged for what I look like. It's practical and honest, and I think that might be enough. It will be enough, Gideon's voice was firm. I'll make sure of it. Reverend Michaels married them 3 days later in a small ceremony attended by Mrs. Colbert, the Reverend's wife, and a handful of curious townspeople who came to witness the spectacle of Gideon Vale marrying the fat bride nobody wanted. Mara wore her best dress. Gideon wore a new suit. They exchanged vows in voices that were steady, if not passionate, and when Reverend Michaels pronounced them married, Gideon kissed her cheek with careful formality. Mrs. Vale, he said quietly, welcome to Iron Ridge. Mara looked at her new husband, this practical stranger who'd somehow become her future, and felt the weight of 7 rejections finally lift from her shoulders. She'd been chosen, not for her beauty, not for her youth, but for her toughness, her capability, her stubborn refusal to break despite everything that tried. For the first time in 32 years, that felt like enough. The wagon ride to Iron Ridge took 4 hours through country that grew progressively wilder with each passing mile. Mara sat beside Gideon on the bench seat, her carpet bag and new trunk secured in the wagon bed, watching Red Hollow disappear behind them, until it was just a smudge of brown against endless sky. Gideon drove in silence, his attention focused on the rutted trail that barely qualified as a road. Mara didn't mind the quiet. After 3 days of wedding preparations and well-meaning advice from Mrs. Colbert, silence felt like mercy. The land stretched in every direction, rolling hills covered in scrub grass, clusters of pine trees that thickened as they climbed elevation, rocky outcroppings that looked like ancient bones breaking through Earth's skin. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Mara tried to imagine living here permanently, 12 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by this vast emptiness. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something close to relief. "How many people work at Iron Ridge?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Depends on the season. Right now, 23. Come roundup, we hire another dozen or so." "And they all eat at the ranch?" "The hands eat in the bunkhouse. I usually take meals in the main house. You'll be cooking for both, but we have a rotation system. You handle main house meals and Sunday dinners for everyone. The rest of the time, the hands cook for themselves or take turns." Mara calculated quickly. Even with a rotation, that was still substantial cooking. "What about supplies?" "Monthly freight wagon from Dawson. We place orders through the mercantile there. Costs more than Red Hollow, but the selection is better." Dawson. County seat, about 30 miles east. It's where most of the territory's money lives, bankers, lawyers, merchants. They throw parties and socials that I usually avoid. His tone made it clear this was a deliberate choice, not circumstance. "Why?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Because they're vultures in fancy clothes. After my wife died, they couldn't decide if they should pity me or try to match me with their daughters. I got tired of both. Will they expect you to bring me to these parties now?" "Probably. We can discuss it when the time comes." That sounded like avoidance, but Mara didn't push. She had enough immediate concerns without worrying about hypothetical social events. The trail climbed steadily, winding through pine forests that smelled sharp and clean. Sunlight filtered through branches and dusty shafts, and somewhere nearby a creek rushed over rocks. It was cooler here than in Red Hollow, the air thin and crisp. "How much farther?" Mara asked. "Another hour. The main house sits in a valley between two ridges. That's where the name comes from. Good grazing land, protected from the worst weather, and the creek runs year-round." "It sounds like you love it." Gideon glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's mine. Built it from nothing 12 years ago. Every fence post, every building, every head of cattle, I put it there. So yes, I suppose I love it, the way you love something you've bled for." The intensity in his voice caught Mara off guard. This was the most emotion she'd heard from him since they met. It made her realize how carefully he controlled himself most of the time, keeping everything locked down tight. "What about your family?" she asked. "Do they visit?" "Dead. My father passed when I was 19. Mother followed 6 months later. No siblings. My wife had family back east, but they cut contact after she died. Blamed me for bringing her west. That's not fair." "Maybe not. But grief doesn't care about fair." He adjusted the reins, guiding the horses around a rocky section. "What about your family?" Mara had been expecting this question eventually. "My mother died when I was 14. My father remarried a year later. His new wife had 3 daughters from her first marriage, all younger and prettier than me. I became the extra daughter nobody quite knew what to do with. When I turned 25, my stepmother suggested I might find better opportunities out west. She even paid for my first ticket. Very generous of her." The bitterness leaked into her voice despite efforts to contain it. Gideon heard it anyway. "She wanted you gone." "Yes, and my father didn't argue. So I went west and discovered that frontier towns don't want fat spinsters any more than eastern families do. I just keep trying different places, hoping one of them will eventually make space for me." Iron Ridge has space. It was a simple statement, but something in Mara's chest loosened slightly. "I hope so." They rode through more forest, then emerged onto a ridge that overlooked a valley so beautiful it made Mara's breath catch. Below, nestled between tree-covered slopes, sat a collection of buildings arranged around a central yard. The main house was large and solid-looking, built from timber and stone with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Beyond it stood a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a long bunkhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. Cattle dotted the valley floor, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Mara couldn't tell from this distance. Fenced pastures divided the land into organized sections, and everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of careful planning and hard work. "That's Iron Ridge," Gideon said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. They descended into the valley, following a well-maintained road that led directly to the main house. As they approached, Mara saw men working near the barn, some repairing fence, others tending horses. Several stopped to watch the wagon, their expressions curious and slightly wary. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and climbed down, then came around to help Mara. His hands on her waist were firm and impersonal, lifting her down like she weighed nothing despite her size. The casual display of strength surprised her. "Wait here," he said, then walked toward a group of men gathered near the barn. Mara stood beside the wagon, acutely aware of being observed. She could feel the ranch hands' stares, could practically hear their thoughts. This was Gideon Vale's new wife? This was the woman he'd chosen? She straightened her spine and met their stares directly, refusing to shrink or apologize for existing. Gideon returned with three men trailing behind him. The first was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and intelligent eyes. The second was younger, broad-shouldered and handsome in a rough way. The third was barely more than a boy, thin and nervous-looking. "Mara, this is Thomas Webb, my foreman." Gideon gestured to the older man. "He runs the daily operations and knows more about ranching than anyone in the territory." Thomas removed his hat, revealing gray hair plastered to his skull. "Ma'am, welcome to Iron Ridge." "Thank you, Mr. Webb." "Just Thomas. We don't stand on ceremony out here." His voice was gravelly but not unkind. Gideon continued. "This is Daniel Cortez, head wrangler, and Jack Morrison, who helps with everything." Daniel nodded, his dark eyes assessing. Jack mumbled something that might have been a greeting while staring at his boots. "They'll help unload your things," Gideon said. "Thomas, spread the word. Mrs. Vale will be taking over household management starting tomorrow. Anyone with concerns or questions should direct them to her." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." The men moved to unload the wagon while Gideon led Mara toward the house. The porch steps were solid under her feet, recently repaired. The front door opened into a large main room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation, and windows that let in streams of afternoon light. It was beautiful and completely impersonal, like a well-furnished hotel room. No personal touches, no photographs or mementos, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. "Kitchen's through there," Gideon pointed to a doorway. "3 bedrooms upstairs. The master bedroom is at the end of the hall. That's yours now." Mara's head snapped around. "Mine?" "Yours." His expression was carefully neutral. "I've been sleeping in the room across the hall since my wife died. I'll continue doing so until or unless you indicate otherwise." Until or unless. The words hung in the air like a question neither of them was ready to answer. "The house needs work," Gideon continued, moving past the awkward moment. "My housekeeper quit 2 months ago, and I've been managing poorly since then. The kitchen is stocked, but the organization is probably terrible. Linens need washing. The whole place could use a thorough cleaning." He was giving her an out, Mara realized, presenting the house's flaws so she wouldn't be shocked later. She appreciated the honesty even as it made her nervous. "I can handle it," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Thomas and the others carried her trunk upstairs while Mara explored the first floor. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a massive stove, deep sink, and more storage than she'd ever had access to before. The pantry held basic supplies, but Gideon was right. The organization was chaos. Flour mixed with canned goods, dried beans in unmarked containers, spices scattered randomly across shelves. It would take days to sort through everything, weeks to truly make the space functional. The prospect should have been daunting, but instead Mara felt something like anticipation. This was work she understood, work she could control. "I'll leave you to settle in," Gideon said from the doorway. "I need to check on the south pasture fence before dark. If you're hungry, there's bread and cheese in the cold box." "When do you usually eat dinner?" 6 o'clock. But don't worry about cooking tonight. You've had a long day. I'd rather cook. The words came out more firmly than Mara intended. I'm here to work. Might as well start now. Something flickered in Gideon's expression. Respect, maybe, or approval. All right, 6 o'clock then. Nothing fancy required. He left through the back door, and Mara heard him speaking to Thomas in low tones before their voices faded into the distance. Alone in the kitchen, she took a slow breath and looked around at her new domain. This was it, her life now. No going back, no second guessing. She was Mrs. Gideon Vale, mistress of Iron Ridge Ranch, responsible for managing a household she'd seen for all of 30 minutes. The panic tried to surface, but Mara shoved it down. She'd survived worse than this. 7 rejections worse. A lifetime of being unwanted worse. At least here she had purpose, and a man who'd promised respect if nothing else. That would have to be enough. She started with the pantry, pulling everything off the shelves and sorting items into logical groups. Flour, sugar, cornmeal. Baking supplies. Beans, rice, dried corn, staples. Canned goods organized by type. Spices alphabetized and stored in matching containers she found shoved in a back corner. 2 hours later, the pantry looked transformed. Mara's back ached and her dress was covered in flour dust. But the satisfaction of seeing order where chaos had been felt like victory. She checked the cold box and found adequate supplies for a simple dinner. Bread was stale but salvageable if toasted. There were eggs, bacon, potatoes that needed using, and half an onion wrapped in cloth. Not fancy, but it would make a decent meal. Mara set to work. She'd learned to cook young. Her stepmother had been happy to delegate that chore to the unwanted stepdaughter, and years of managing boarding house kitchens had made her efficient. By 5:30, she had bacon sizzling in a pan, potatoes cut and frying, and eggs waiting to be scrambled. At exactly 6 o'clock, she heard boots on the porch. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway, dusty and tired-looking. He'd washed his face and hands at the pump outside, but his clothes still carried the smell of horses and work. "Smells good," he said, surveying the kitchen. His eyes caught on the pantry's new organization, visible through the open door. "You've been busy." "Couldn't leave it that way. I'd never find anything." "Fair enough." He moved to the table and sat down heavily. "Do you need help?" "No, just sit." Mara plated food and brought it to the table. Bacon crispy the way she preferred it, potatoes golden brown with caramelized onions, eggs scrambled soft with a little milk. Simple food, but prepared with care. Gideon ate like a man who'd forgotten what decent cooking tasted like. He finished everything on his plate in near silence, then looked up at Mara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is good. Really good." "It's just eggs and bacon." "It's the first decent meal I've had in this house since Martha left. I've been living on beans and whatever Thomas's wife sends over out of pity." He pushed his plate away. "If the rest of your cooking is this good, the hands are going to think they've died and gone to heaven." Mara felt heat creep up her neck. Compliments always made her uncomfortable, especially from men. "I can cook better than this once I know what supplies are available." "Then we'll make sure you have whatever you need." They cleaned up together in awkward silence, neither quite sure how to navigate this strange domesticity. This was their first evening as a married couple, but nothing about it felt romantic or even particularly intimate. Just two people sharing space, figuring out how to coexist. When the dishes were done, Gideon paused at the kitchen door. "I usually sit on the porch before bed. You're welcome to join me if you want, or not. Whatever suits you." He left before Mara could respond, giving her the choice without pressure. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, then followed him outside. The evening air was cooler than in Red Hollow, carrying the scent of pine and grass and something else she couldn't identify. Maybe just space, the smell of land that stretched farther than eyes could measure. Gideon sat in a chair on the porch's far end, his boots propped on the railing, staring out at the darkening valley. Mara took a chair several feet away, maintaining distance. They sat in silence while sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Cattle lowed in the distance. Somewhere, men's voices carried across the yard, followed by laughter. The bunkhouse door opened and closed, spilling lamplight briefly before darkness returned. "It's beautiful," Mara said finally. "It is. Do you ever get used to it, the size of everything?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "No, that's one of the things I like about it. Every sunset feels new. Every morning, the land looks different depending on the light. It never gets small or ordinary. That must be nice. Where I grew up, everything was small and ordinary. Same streets, same buildings, same people saying the same things year after year. Is that why you left? Part of it. Mostly I left because there was no room for me there. My stepmother made that clear. Mara pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. What about you? Why did you come west? To build something mine. My father was a tenant farmer back east, worked land he'd never owned, lived in a house that belonged to someone else, died without anything to pass down except debts. I swore I wouldn't do the same, so I came west, worked other men's ranches until I saved enough for my own land, and built Iron Ridge from nothing. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. This ranch wasn't just property to him, it was proof he'd succeeded where his father had failed, proof he'd created something permanent. And your wife? How did she feel about it? Gideon's jaw tightened. She hated it. Tried to hide it at first, but the isolation broke her. She was a town woman, used to neighbors and shops and social calls. Out here, there was just work and silence. By the end, I think she resented me for bringing her to this place. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was my fault. I married her because she was beautiful and willing, not because she was suited for this life. I learned from that mistake. He glanced at Mara. That's why I chose you. Because you're suited for it, whether you realize it yet or not. The comment should have felt insulting. You're not beautiful, but at least you're practical. But somehow it didn't. Maybe because Gideon's tone held no malice, just honesty delivered bluntly, the way he delivered everything. Full dark settled over the valley. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, making Mara shiver despite her shawl. You should go in, Gideon said. Mountain nights get cold, even in summer. Your bedroom is the one with the blue quilt on the bed. Towels are in the chest at the foot of it. If you need anything, I'm across the hall. It was a dismissal, gentle but clear. Mara stood, suddenly exhausted from travel and emotional upheaval and the weight of starting a completely new life. Thank you for dinner, Gideon added as she reached the door. It was good to have someone cook in that kitchen again. Mara nodded and went inside, climbing the stairs to her new bedroom. The room was large and simply furnished, a 4-poster bed with the promised blue quilt, a dresser and wardrobe, a washstand with pitcher and basin. More impersonal space, like the rest of the house. She unpacked her few belongings, then sat on the bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd married a stranger and moved to an isolated ranch 12 miles from the nearest town. She was responsible for managing a household she barely understood and cooking for men she'd never met. And tonight, she would sleep alone in a bedroom that used to belong to a dead woman. The panic surfaced despite her efforts to contain it. Her breathing came fast and shallow, her hands shaking as she gripped the quilt. This was insane. She was insane. What had possessed her to think this would work? But then she remembered standing on 7 bride platforms. Remembered being passed over 7 times while younger, prettier women were chosen. Remembered her stepmother's not-so-subtle hints about finding better opportunities elsewhere. Remembered years of being told through 1,000 small cruelties that women like her didn't deserve love or partnership or even basic consideration. At least here, she had a purpose. At least here, Gideon Vale had looked at her and seen value instead of something to overlook. That had to count for something. Mara changed into her nightgown, washed her face, and climbed into bed. The mattress was comfortable, the quilt warm despite the room's chill. Through the window, she could see stars so bright and numerous they looked like scattered diamonds. Across the hall, she heard movement, Gideon preparing for bed. The sounds were oddly comforting, proof she wasn't completely alone in this vast, dark valley. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The next morning arrived with rooster crows and the sound of men moving around the yard. Mara woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was before memory crashed back. Iron Ridge. Her new home. Her first full day as Mrs. Gideon Vale. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Gideon already in the kitchen, boiling water for coffee. He'd clearly been awake for hours. His hair was damp from washing, and he wore clean work clothes. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Coffee will be ready in a minute." "What time do the men eat breakfast?" 5:30 in the bunkhouse. Thomas's wife usually handles it, but she's visiting her sister in Dawson this week. The hands have been managing on their own, meaning they'd been eating poorly. Mara could work with that. Starting tomorrow, I'll handle it, she said. What time do they break for dinner? Noon, they come to the yard and eat whatever's available, usually leftovers or sandwiches. Sunday is the only day we do a proper sit-down meal together. Mara nodded, already planning menus in her head. I'll need to see the food stores, not just what's in the house, but what's available for the bunkhouse kitchen. And I'll need to know about dietary restrictions, allergies, preferences. Gideon's eyebrows rose. You're taking this seriously. You hired me to manage the household. That includes feeding the men who work here. I can't do that properly without information. Something in his expression shifted. That look of respect she'd seen occasionally, like she'd passed some unspoken test. All right. After breakfast, I'll take you to meet everyone properly. Thomas can give you the details you need. They ate in comfortable silence, coffee and toast with jam, simple but adequate. Mara made mental notes about what supplies needed replenishing. The jam was nearly empty. The coffee tin was low. They'd need fresh bread soon. After breakfast, Gideon led her to the bunkhouse. Inside, 23 men in various states of waking up turned to stare as she entered. Mara felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. Thomas was there, looking more alert than anyone else. He nodded at Mara. Morning, Mrs. Vale. Good morning, Thomas. She kept her voice steady despite nervousness. Mr. Vale tells me I'll be managing meals starting tomorrow. I need to know what I'm working with. Thomas's expression suggested he hadn't expected her to jump straight into work. All right, come with me. He led her to the bunkhouse kitchen, a large functional space with 2 big stoves, plenty of counter room, and storage that made the main house pantry look tiny. The supplies were better organized than expected, probably Thomas's doing. We order bulk goods monthly, Thomas explained. Flour, sugar, beans, rice, salt pork, canned goods. Fresh meat comes from our own cattle when we butcher. We've got chickens for eggs. Garden provides vegetables in summer, but we're running low this late in the season. Mara surveyed the stores with a practiced eye. This is good. I can work with this. What about the men? Any dietary issues I should know about? Daniel can't eat milk, gives him terrible stomach trouble. Young Jack doesn't like spicy food, but he'll eat it if that's what's served. A few of the boys get tired of beans, but that's just complaining, not an actual problem. And preferences? Thomas scratched his jaw. Most of them would eat cardboard if it was hot and filling. They're not picky, but they do appreciate variety when they can get it. And decent baking, fresh bread, biscuits, the occasional pie that goes a long way toward morale. Mara nodded, filing away the information. I'll start with breakfast tomorrow. 5:30? Yes, ma'am. I'll spread the word. She spent the rest of the morning touring the ranch, learning its layout and rhythms. Gideon introduced her to every man who worked there, and Mara forced herself to remember names and faces. Most of the hands were polite but wary, clearly uncertain what to make of their boss's new wife. Only one man was openly hostile. His name was Frank Delaney, a thick-bodied cowboy with a mean mouth and eyes that assessed Mara with undisguised contempt. So you're the one Vale picked, Frank said when they were introduced. His tone made it clear what he thought of Gideon's choice. I am, Mara replied evenly. Interesting. Could have sworn he'd go for someone younger, prettier. But I guess when you're desperate, you take what you can get. The words landed like stones. Several other men shifted uncomfortably, but no one contradicted Frank. Before Mara could respond, Gideon stepped between them. His voice went cold and flat in a way that made every man within earshot go still. That's my wife you're talking about, Frank. And on my ranch, we treat women with respect. All women. You understand me? Frank held Gideon's gaze for a long moment, something ugly flickering in his expression. Then he shrugged. Sure, boss. No disrespect intended. See that there isn't. Gideon turned to Mara. Let's move on. They walked away, leaving Frank glowering behind them. Mara's hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. Does he always talk to people like that? Frank's got a mean streak. I keep him on because he's good with horses, but I don't particularly like him. Gideon's jaw was tight. He won't bother you again. I'll make sure of it. But Frank's words had already done their damage. They echoed every cruel thing Mara had heard over the years, every whispered comment about her body, every pitying look that said she should be grateful for any man's attention. She pushed the feelings down and focused on work. That's what she was here for, work, not validation. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Mara cleaned the main house from top to bottom, organized supplies, made lists of what needed replacing. She cooked a proper dinner, roasted chicken with vegetables and fresh biscuits that made Gideon's eyes widen when he tasted them. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, around a mouthful of biscuit. "Practice. Lots of practice. When you're the extra daughter nobody wants around, you learn to make yourself useful." "Well, you're definitely useful now. If the hands eat like this tomorrow, you'll have 23 new admirers." Mara doubted that. Frank's contempt had made it clear not everyone would appreciate her presence. But she appreciated Gideon's attempt at reassurance. That night, she lay in bed exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind kept replaying the day, analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of acceptance or rejection. Most of the men had been polite but distant. A few had seemed genuinely friendly. Frank had been openly hostile. And Gideon? He remained an enigma. Respectful, but remote. Appreciative of her work, but emotionally distant. Exactly what he'd promised. Honesty and respect, but nothing resembling affection. Mara told herself that was fine. She hadn't married for love. She'd married for survival, for a place to belong. If that place came without warmth or tenderness, well, at least it came with purpose. The next morning, she woke at 4:30 and made her way to the bunkhouse kitchen. Several men were already moving around, preparing for the day's work. They stopped and stared when she entered. "Morning," Mara said, tying on an apron. "I'm making breakfast. You're all welcome to stay and eat, or you can take it with you if you're in a hurry." She set to work without waiting for responses. Bacon in one pan, eggs in another, biscuits in the oven, gravy on the stove. The familiar motions calmed her nerves. This was something she knew how to do. By 5:30, breakfast was ready. The men filed through, filling plates with expressions ranging from surprised to pleased. Even Frank took a biscuit, though he didn't thank her. Thomas was the last through the line. He surveyed the spread, bacon, scrambled eggs, biscuits with sausage gravy, fried potatoes, then looked at Mara with something like amazement. "Ma'am, if you cook like this every morning, we're going to get spoiled." "Good," Mara said firmly. "Hard work deserves decent food." Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, the hands were showing up for meals with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. Mara found herself cooking not just breakfast, but also dinner, preparing food that was hearty and flavorful despite limited supplies. She fell into a rhythm. Up at 4:30 to start breakfast. Clean up, then focus on household chores until midday dinner preparation. Afternoon spent on laundry, mending, organizing. Evening meal for Gideon and herself. Dishes, then a brief rest before bed. The work was relentless, but Mara thrived on it. For the first time in her life, her competence mattered more than her appearance. The men might have judged her body initially, but her cooking earned their respect. Even Frank stopped making snide comments after she prepared his favorite meal, chicken fried steak with cream gravy, without being asked. 2 weeks into her marriage, Mara was in the bunkhouse kitchen when she overheard a conversation between several ranch hands. "I'm telling you, Vale made the right choice," one said. "That woman can cook better than my own mother." "And she's tough," another added. "Been working dawn to dusk without complaint. Most of the women who've come through here quit inside a week." "Yeah, but you've seen her. She's not exactly—" "Shut up, Martinez. Who cares what she looks like? She feeds us like kings and keeps this place running smooth. That's all that matters." Mara stood frozen on the other side of the door, her heart pounding. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement. They still thought she was ugly, just useful. But it was acceptance of a sort. Recognition that she had value beyond appearance. She'd take it. That evening, she told Gideon about the conversation, editing out the part about her looks. He listened carefully, then nodded. "Good. I knew they'd come around once they saw what you could do." "Frank still hates me." "Frank hates everyone except his horse. Don't take it personally." They were sitting on the porch again, watching another sunset. This had become their routine, shared silence at day's end, neither pushing for conversation but both seeming to appreciate the company. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said after a while. "Go ahead." "Do you regret it? Choosing me?" Gideon was quiet long enough that Mara regretted asking. Then he turned to look at her directly, his expression serious. "No. You've exceeded every expectation. The house runs better than it has in 3 years. The men are happier. Even the horses seem calmer." He paused. "You belong here, Mara." I hope you're starting to feel that. The words shouldn't have mattered so much. They were practical, focused on her utility rather than any personal value. But they burrowed into Mara's chest anyway, warm and solid. I'm starting to, she admitted. Good. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now. Less awkward, more companionable. The third week brought Mara's first real test. A supply wagon was due from Dawson, but heavy rains had washed out part of the road. The wagon couldn't get through, which meant no fresh supplies for at least another week. Thomas delivered the news with visible concern. We're getting low on flour and sugar. Salt pork's almost gone. I can send someone to Red Hollow, but their prices are terrible and selection is limited. Mara surveyed the remaining supplies with a calculating eye. We have beans, rice, cornmeal, and canned goods. I can make that work for a week. Tell the men meals will be simpler, but no one will go hungry. She spent the next 7 days performing minor miracles with limited ingredients. Bean soup stretched with rice and vegetables. Cornmeal pancakes for breakfast instead of biscuits. Creative use of canned tomatoes and beef to make stews that felt more substantial than they were. The men grumbled about the simpler fare, but no one complained seriously. And when the supply wagon finally arrived a week later, Mara had managed to keep everyone fed without running completely out of anything. Gideon found her in the kitchen that evening, kneading dough for the next day's bread. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. Thomas told me what you did this week, how you stretched supplies when the wagon couldn't get through. I just cooked with what was available. You kept 23 men fed and working on limited resources. That's management, not just cooking. He paused. My first wife would have panicked, would have demanded someone go to Red Hollow immediately, regardless of cost. You just handled it. Mara's hands stilled in the dough. I've had practice making do with less. Comes from years of not having much. Well, it's valuable here. This ranch runs on problem solving as much as hard work. You're good at both. He left before Mara could respond, but his words lingered. Valuable. Good at. These weren't declarations of affection, but they were recognition, proof that she mattered in ways beyond just filling space. The fourth week brought a different challenge. A neighboring rancher, Samuel Cross, rode over with his wife Elizabeth, the pretty young bride who'd been selected in Red Hollow. They came ostensibly to welcome Mara to the territory, but their real purpose was obviously curiosity. Elizabeth was even more beautiful than Mara remembered. Golden hair, delicate features, a figure that made her look like a china doll. She moved through Iron Ridge's main house with wide-eyed wonder, exclaiming over every detail. Oh, Mara, your home is lovely, so large and comfortable. You must be very happy here. The words were kind, but Mara heard the unspoken question. How did you end up here when women like me exist? Samuel and Gideon talked business on the porch, while Elizabeth followed Mara into the kitchen. The younger woman watched as Mara prepared coffee and sliced cake, a spice cake she'd made that morning with precious cinnamon from the newly arrived supplies. I must confess, I was surprised when I heard Gideon had married, Elizabeth said carefully. After losing his first wife, everyone assumed he'd stay a widower. Life is surprising sometimes. And you're managing the household yourself? No help? Just me. The ranch keeps everyone else busy. Elizabeth's expression suggested this confirmed something she'd suspected. That must be terribly difficult. I have 2 girls who help with our household, and I still feel overwhelmed sometimes. Of course, Samuel's ranch is much smaller than Iron Ridge. The subtle boast wasn't lost on Mara. Elizabeth wanted her to know that despite being chosen by a lesser rancher, she still had an easier life. More help, less work, probably more affection from her husband too. I don't mind the work, Mara said evenly. It keeps me occupied. Still, it seems unfair that you should have to do everything yourself. Perhaps I could speak to Samuel about finding you some help. We know several girls looking for employment. That's kind but unnecessary. I prefer managing things myself. Elizabeth's smile tightened slightly. She'd come expecting to find Mara struggling, maybe even miserable. Instead, she'd found a woman who was competent and apparently content. It clearly confused her. They took coffee to the porch where the men were deep in conversation about cattle prices and grazing rights. Samuel barely glanced at the refreshments, but Gideon paused to taste the cake. This is excellent, he said to Mara. Best spice cake I've ever had. Samuel finally paid attention. Your wife bakes too? Elizabeth hasn't quite mastered that yet. The girls usually handle our baking. The comment was meant to be teasing, but Elizabeth flushed. Gideon's expression went flat. Mara manages the entire household and feeds 30 people daily. Her baking is the least impressive thing she does. The statement hung in the air, sharp and defensive. Samuel looked taken aback. Elizabeth's flush deepened, and Mara felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Gideon had just defended her, not with false compliments about her appearance, but by highlighting her actual value. The visit ended shortly after, both couples clearly relieved to part ways. After Samuel and Elizabeth left, Mara cleaned up in silence while Gideon watched from the doorway. "That was awkward," he said finally. "They came to see if I was as pathetic as they expected." "Probably." Gideon's tone was matter-of-fact. "Samuel's not a bad man, but his wife is young and shallow. They'll gossip about this visit for weeks." "Let them." Mara scrubbed a plate with more force than necessary. "I don't care what they think." "Don't you?" The question made her pause. "I'm trying not to." Gideon moved into the kitchen, stopping a few feet away. "For what it's worth, you impressed them. Elizabeth expected to find you struggling. Instead, she found you competent and confident. That's why she got defensive about her hired help." "She's beautiful, and I'm not. That's all anyone will remember." "Maybe, but beauty doesn't keep a ranch running. Capability does. And you've got that in abundance." It was the closest thing to a compliment about her as a person rather than just her work. Mara didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded and returned to washing dishes. That night, lying in bed, she thought about Elizabeth's visit, about the younger woman's confusion at finding Mara not just surviving but thriving, about Gideon's unexpected defense. Maybe she didn't need to be beautiful. Maybe being competent, capable, and tough enough to survive frontier life was enough. The month anniversary of their marriage arrived quietly. Mara marked it only because Mrs. Colbert's letter mentioned it. The boarding house owner had taken to writing weekly, hungry for news from Iron Ridge. Mara was in the garden when Gideon found her, pulling weeds from the vegetable plot she'd started behind the house. It was late afternoon, the sun still warm but losing its harsh edge. "Can you spare a minute?" he asked. "Of course." Mara stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Gideon led her to the barn where a horse stood in one of the stalls, a sturdy mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. "Her name is Juniper," Gideon said. "She's gentle, well-trained, and steady. I'm giving her to you." Mara stared. "What?" "You need your own horse. You can't walk to town if you need something, and you shouldn't have to ask to borrow a mount every time you want to ride somewhere. Juniper is yours." "I don't understand. Why?" Gideon looked uncomfortable. "Because you're my wife. Because you work harder than anyone on this ranch. Because it's been a month, and you haven't complained once despite everything being new and difficult. Take your pick." Mara approached the stall slowly. Juniper nickered softly and nuzzled her hand, seeking treats. The horse was beautiful, dappled gray with a white blaze down her face. "She's wonderful," Mara said quietly. "Thank you." "You're welcome." They stood there in the barn's dusty dimness, something unspoken passing between them. It wasn't love, not even close, but it was connection, recognition, a tentative friendship building between two damaged people who'd agreed to share a life. "I should get back to dinner," Mara said finally. "I'll help you." And he did, for the first time since their marriage. Gideon worked beside her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables while she prepared meat, their movements synchronized through trial and error. They barely spoke, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. When they sat down to eat, Mara looked across the table at this man who'd chosen her when no one else would, who defended her to neighbors and gave her horses and treated her work as valuable, who still slept across the hall but seemed to be slowly, carefully, building something between them. It wasn't what she had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was real and honest and maybe, just maybe, enough to build a life on. "Thank you," she said. "For the horse, for everything." Gideon met her eyes. "You've earned it, Mara. And more." The words settled between them, warm and solid. Outside, the sun set over Iron Ridge in shades of crimson and gold, and inside, two practical strangers who'd become something like partners shared a meal in companionable silence. It was a beginning, imperfect and unglamorous, but real. And for the first time in 32 years, Mara Holloway Vale thought that might actually be enough. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks into Mara's marriage, delivered by a writer from Dawson, who handed Gideon the cream-colored envelope with a smirk that suggested he knew exactly what trouble it contained. Gideon read it at the breakfast table, his jaw tightening with each line. Then he set it down beside his coffee cup and pushed it toward Mara without comment. She picked it up, noting the expensive paper and elegant script before reading the contents. Mr. Harrison Caldwell and Mrs. Vivian Caldwell cordially invited Mr. and Mrs. Gideon Vale to their annual autumn social to be held Saturday evening at their residence in Dawson. Formal attire requested. "Who are the Caldwells?" Mara asked, though she could guess from the invitation's tone. Money, status, the kind of people who threw parties to remind everyone of their importance. Harrison owns the territory's largest bank. Vivian fancies herself Dawson's social queen. They throw this party every year, and every year I find an excuse not to attend. Gideon took a long drink of coffee. Unfortunately, I promised Harrison I'd discuss a business loan. He knows I can't avoid him forever. So we're going. I am. You don't have to. Mara set the invitation down carefully. Will people expect me to be there? Yes. And they'll gossip either way, about you coming or about you hiding at the ranch. Take your pick which rumor you'd rather deal with. It was a trap either way, Mara realized. Stay home and confirm she was too ashamed to show her face in society. Attend and subject herself to the scrutiny of Dawson's elite, who would judge her body, her background, her very right to be married to Gideon Vale. I'll go, she heard herself say. Gideon's eyebrows rose. You sure? No. But I'm tired of hiding. If people want to stare at me, they can do it while I'm standing right in front of them. Something flickered in Gideon's expression. Respect, maybe, or concern. It won't be pleasant. Dawson society can be vicious. I've survived worse. Have you? The question hung between them. Mara thought about 7 bride platforms and a lifetime of whispered cruelty and finally met his eyes. I guess we'll find out. The problem was immediately apparent. Mara had nothing appropriate to wear to a formal social event. Her 2 dresses were practical cotton, suitable for ranch work but completely inadequate for mingling with bankers and their wives. Mrs. Colbert's next letter provided the solution. The boarding house owner wrote that she knew an excellent seamstress in Red Hollow who could work quickly if needed, and would Mara like her to arrange a consultation? The subtext was clear. Mrs. Colbert had heard about the invitation through the gossip network and was offering help. Mara wrote back accepting the offer, and 3 days later found herself riding Juniper into Red Hollow with Gideon accompanying her. The seamstress, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Price, took one look at Mara and nodded as if confirming something. Mrs. Colbert said you'd need something for the Caldwell social. Formal, but not fussy, suitable for a ranch woman who doesn't put on airs. Am I right? Yes, Mara said, grateful for the understanding. Margaret took measurements efficiently, her hands quick and impersonal. You're fuller figured than most women I dress, but that's not a problem. We'll use good fabric, cut it properly, and you'll look fine. Better than fine if you trust me. I trust you. Good. Come back in 4 days for a fitting. The dress cost more than Mara wanted to spend, but Gideon paid without comment. On the ride back to Iron Ridge, he was unusually quiet. You didn't have to do this, Mara said finally. Go to the party, I mean. If you'd rather avoid it, I need the loan for spring expansion, and avoiding it just delays the inevitable. He glanced at her. Are you having second thoughts? Constantly, but I meant what I said. I'm tired of hiding. Even if they're cruel? Especially then. At least I'll know who my enemies are. Gideon's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile. You're tougher than I thought, and I already thought you were pretty tough. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Mara focused on Juniper's steady gait and tried not to think too hard about what Saturday would bring. The fitting 4 days later revealed a dress that made Mara's breath catch. Margaret had chosen deep forest green silk that brought out the color in Mara's eyes. The cut was elegant but modest, with long sleeves and a neckline that was flattering without being revealing. Most importantly, it fit properly, tailored to her body rather than trying to hide it. You look good, Margaret said with satisfaction, not trying to be something you're not, just yourself but dressed up proper. Mara studied her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. She still looked like herself. Round face, soft body, plain features, but somehow the dress made those things seem less like flaws. Or maybe it was just the first time in her life she'd worn something made specifically for her body, instead of something altered to barely fit. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see how those Dawson ladies react. Some of them won't know what to do with a woman who looks confident despite not fitting their narrow definition of beauty." Saturday arrived too quickly. Mara spent the morning trying not to panic and the afternoon preparing herself with methodical care. She washed her hair, pinned it up in a style Mrs. Colbert had taught her, and put on the green dress with hands that only trembled slightly. When she came downstairs, Gideon was waiting in the front room wearing a dark suit that made him look even more imposing than usual. He turned at the sound of her footsteps and went still. "Well?" Mara asked, suddenly nervous. "Will I embarrass you?" "No." His voice was rough. "You look good. Really good." It wasn't poetry, but coming from Gideon, it felt like high praise. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The ride to Dawson took 3 hours in the wagon. They talked sporadically, mostly about ranch business, and nothing about the evening ahead. As they approached the town, Mara's anxiety ratcheted higher with each passing mile. Dawson was larger than Red Hollow, with paved streets and brick buildings that spoke of prosperity. The Caldwell residence sat on a hill overlooking the main street, a massive house with white columns and manicured gardens that looked absurdly out of place in frontier territory. Other wagons and carriages were already arriving, discharging well-dressed couples who moved toward the house with easy confidence. Mara watched them and felt her courage wavering. "We can still leave," Gideon said quietly. "Tell them you took ill. Harrison will be disappointed, but he'll survive." "No, I said I'd do this." Mara straightened her spine. "Let's get it over with." Inside, the house was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers, expensive furniture, paintings on walls that would have cost more than most people earned in a year. Servants circulated with trays of drinks and delicate appetizers. Women in elaborate gowns clustered in groups, talking behind fans. Men gathered near the fireplace, cigars in hand, discussing business and politics. Vivian Caldwell descended on them immediately, a tall woman in her 40s with sharp features and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Gideon, how wonderful that you finally decided to join us, and this must be your new wife." Her gaze swept over Mara with the precision of a surgeon examining a specimen. "How interesting. I'd heard you'd married, but the descriptions didn't quite do you justice, my dear." The comment could have been a compliment, but the tone made it clear it wasn't. Mara forced a smile. "Thank you for inviting us, Mrs. Caldwell. Your home is beautiful." "Yes, well, Harrison and I believe in maintaining certain standards even out here in the wilderness." Vivian's attention had already shifted to someone more interesting. "Do excuse me. I must greet the Harrisons. Help yourselves to refreshments." She glided away, leaving Mara and Gideon standing awkwardly in the entrance hall. Other guests had noticed their arrival and were staring with poorly concealed curiosity. "That's the reception we can expect all evening," Gideon muttered. "False politeness covering genuine disdain if you want to leave." "No." Mara lifted her chin. "I didn't put on this dress just to run away at the first insult." They moved into the main parlor where most guests had gathered. Conversations didn't exactly stop when they entered, but they shifted, voices dropping to whispers, eyes cutting in their direction. Mara felt the weight of judgment, like physical pressure. A few people approached to offer stiff congratulations on their marriage. Most were transparently curious, asking questions designed to probe for gossip material. Where had they met? How long had they courted? What had drawn them to each other? Gideon handled it with blunt honesty that made Mara's stomach clench. "I needed a wife who could manage a ranch household. Mara needed a home. We made an arrangement that benefits us both." The words were truthful but harsh, reducing their marriage to pure transaction. Mara saw the other guests' reactions: pity, amusement, satisfaction at having their assumptions confirmed. Poor Gideon Vale, trapped in a practical marriage to an unattractive woman. Poor Mara Holloway, so desperate she'd accept any man who'd have her. After the third such conversation, Mara excused herself to find the powder room. She needed space to breathe, to steady herself, to remember why she'd thought attending this party was a good idea. The powder room was mercifully empty. Mara stood in front of the mirror, taking slow breaths and trying to calm her racing heart. She looked good. Margaret had been right about that. The dress fit perfectly. Her hair was neat, and her face showed determination despite the anxiety churning underneath. The door opened behind her. 3 women entered, laughing together until they saw Mara. Their laughter died. "Oh," said the first woman, young, blonde, beautiful in a delicate way. "You're Gideon Vale's wife." "I am." Mara met her gaze in the mirror. "I'm Catherine Morris. This is Jane Fletcher and Sarah Cross." Sarah was Samuel Cross's sister, Mara realized. More connections to the couple who'd visited Iron Ridge. "We've been dying to meet you. The stories have been absolutely fascinating." "What stories?" Catherine smiled with false sweetness. "About how Gideon married you after his housekeeper quit. How practical it was. How you're really more of an employee than a wife." She tilted her head. "Is it true he still sleeps in a separate bedroom?" The question hit like a slap. Mara's face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "My marriage is none of your concern." "Oh, don't be touchy. We're just curious. I mean, you have to admit it's unusual. Gideon could have chosen anyone. There are plenty of suitable women in Dawson. But instead he picked well, Catherine's gaze traveled deliberately over Mara's body. "Someone from a bride platform. It's quite the love story, if you can call it that." Jane Fletcher giggled. Sarah looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict her friends. Mara wanted to run, wanted to hide in this bathroom until the party ended and she could escape back to Iron Ridge. But she thought about 7 platforms and 32 years of shrinking herself to make other people comfortable, and something hard settled in her chest. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not a love story. Gideon needed someone capable of managing his ranch, and I needed a home. That's the truth. And I'm not ashamed of it. Maybe it's not romantic, but it's honest, which is more than I can say for half the marriages in this room." She pushed past them and left the powder room, her heart hammering. Behind her, she heard Catherine's voice, sharp with disbelief. "Can you believe her? Acting like she has the right to lecture us." Back in the main parlor, Mara found Gideon in conversation with Harrison Caldwell and several other men. He looked up as she approached, his expression sharpening when he saw her face. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I need a moment with my wife." He guided her to a quieter corner. "What happened?" "Nothing. Just met some of Dawson's charming society ladies." "What did they say?" "The usual. That I'm more employee than wife. That you only married me because you needed a housekeeper. That our marriage is a joke." The words tumbled out faster than Mara intended. "They asked if you still sleep in a separate bedroom, like that's any of their business." Gideon's expression went cold and flat, in a way Mara had learned to recognize. He was furious. "Who?" "It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Tell me who." "Catherine Morris and her friends. But honestly, they're just saying what everyone's thinking. You heard the conversations earlier. People assume our marriage is nothing but a business arrangement, and you more or less confirmed it. Because it is a business arrangement. I wasn't going to lie about it." "I know, I'm not asking you to lie, I just—" Mara stopped, not sure what she was asking for. Romance she didn't expect? Affection that had never been promised? Some sign that she was more than just a competent ranch manager? Gideon studied her face. "Do you want to leave?" "Yes, but I'm not going to. Running away just proves them right." "Proves them right about what?" "That I don't belong here. That I should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect I can get. That women like me don't deserve better." Mara's voice cracked despite her efforts to control it. "I've spent my whole life being told that. I'm tired of believing it." Something shifted in Gideon's expression. He took her hand, the first time he'd voluntarily touched her beyond the practical necessities of daily life, and led her toward the center of the parlor where several couples were dancing to music from a small quartet. "What are you doing?" Mara asked. "Dancing with my wife. Is that allowed?" "I don't know how to dance. Not properly." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out." He positioned them awkwardly on the dance floor, one hand on her waist, the other holding hers. Around them, other couples moved with practiced grace. Gideon and Mara stumbled through approximations of the steps, neither quite sure what they were doing. It should have been humiliating. Mara was acutely aware of people watching, of her body pressing against Gideon's, of how clumsy they must look compared to the other dancers. But Gideon's grip was steady, and his eyes stayed fixed on her face rather than the watching crowd. Why are you doing this? Mara asked quietly. Because Catherine Morris is watching with her mouth hanging open. Because every person in this room assumes our marriage is loveless and convenient, and I'm tired of them being right. He pulled her slightly closer. And because you put on a dress and came to this terrible party, even though you knew it would be awful, and that deserves better than me letting society ladies insult you in bathrooms. I can handle insults. I know you can. You've been handling them your whole life. But maybe you shouldn't have to anymore. The music swelled. Mara and Gideon continued their awkward dance, neither graceful nor romantic, but somehow meaningful in its stubborn persistence. When the song ended, Gideon didn't immediately release her. For the record, he said, voice low enough that only she could hear, our marriage might have started as a business arrangement, but it's becoming something more. I don't know what yet, but it's more. And anyone who suggests you're just my housekeeper is going to answer to me. Mara's throat felt tight. Why? Because you're my wife. Because you work harder than any person I've ever met. Because you deserve respect even if you don't believe you do. He stepped back, putting distance between them. Now let's get through the rest of this party so I can get you home. The evening dragged on with excruciating slowness. Mara endured more conversations, more thinly veiled insults disguised as concern, more pitying looks from women who couldn't imagine accepting such a practical marriage. But every time her courage faltered, she remembered Gideon's hand on her waist and his words about their marriage becoming something more. Harrison Caldwell cornered Gideon near the end of the evening to discuss business. Mara found herself standing alone near the refreshment table, trying to look occupied while desperately wishing the night would end. Mrs. Vale. She turned to find a woman in her 50s approaching, elegantly dressed with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes that suggested she might actually mean well. I'm Margaret Henderson. My husband owns the general store in Dawson. I wanted to introduce myself properly. Mrs. Henderson. Mara braced for whatever came next. I also wanted to apologize for tonight. Dawson society can be cruel to outsiders, especially women who don't fit their narrow expectations. Margaret's voice was gentle. I've watched you handle yourself with grace despite considerable provocation. That takes strength. The kindness was so unexpected that Mara felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. I mean it. My own marriage raised eyebrows years ago. I was nearly 40 and unmarried when I met my husband. People said terrible things about desperate spinsters and men who couldn't find younger wives. But we've been happy for 15 years despite their predictions. She smiled. Sometimes the marriages that start practically end up being the strongest. They're built on respect instead of infatuation. I hope you're right. Give it time and ignore the Catherine Morrises of the world. They're young and foolish and think beauty is the only currency that matters. Life has a way of teaching them otherwise. Margaret excused herself shortly after, leaving Mara feeling slightly less alone. Maybe not everyone in Dawson was cruel. Maybe some people could see past her body to whatever else she offered. The ride home was quiet. Gideon seemed lost in thought, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Mara was too exhausted for conversation, her emotions raw from hours of enduring judgment. I'm sorry, Gideon said finally, breaking the silence. I shouldn't have made you go through that. You didn't make me. I chose to go. Because I put you in a position where both choices were bad. Stay home and let them gossip about you hiding, or attend and suffer their cruelty directly. Mara was quiet for a moment. Would your first wife have gone? To a party like that? Gideon's hands tightened on the reins. No. She hated social events even before we moved to Iron Ridge. Said people stared at her like she was a prize to be admired. It made her uncomfortable. At least people admired her. Is that what you want? Admiration? I don't know what I want. Mara pulled her shawl tighter against the night air. I just know I'm tired of being judged and found wanting. Tired of having my worth measured by how much space my body takes up. Then stop measuring yourself that way. It's not that simple, isn't it? Gideon glanced at her. You've spent 6 weeks proving your worth at Iron Ridge. Every man on that ranch respects you. You keep the household running smoothly, feed 30 people daily, and handle problems without complaint. You're competent, tough, and more valuable than half the pampered society ladies we saw tonight. So why does their opinion matter more than reality? Because they're beautiful and I'm not. Because their husbands probably love them and you... Mara stopped, realizing what she'd been about to say. And I what? Gideon's voice was quiet. Don't love you? The question hung in the darkness. Mara couldn't see his face clearly enough to read his expression. You told me from the beginning not to expect love. You said our marriage was practical, built on mutual need rather than affection. And that's fine. I agreed to those terms. But watching other couples tonight, seeing how they looked at each other, it made me realize what I'll never have. What makes you think you'll never have it? Because men don't fall in love with women like me. They appreciate our competence and value our work, but they don't love us. Not the way they love beautiful women. Gideon was silent for so long that Mara thought he wouldn't respond. Then he said, My first wife was beautiful. Everyone agreed on that. And I thought I loved her when we married. But love built on beauty is fragile. When frontier life stripped away the prettiness, when her hands got rough and her face weathered and she started looking tired instead of decorative, that shallow love crumbled. By the end, we could barely stand to be in the same room. He paused, guiding the horses around a rough patch in the road. You're right that what we have isn't love. Not yet. But it's built on something stronger than beauty. It's built on respect and honesty and the daily choice to show up and do the work of partnership. Maybe that foundation is strong enough to support something more. Or maybe it's just wishful thinking. Maybe. But I'd rather have honest uncertainty than false certainty based on nothing but appearance. They rode the rest of the way in silence. When they reached Iron Ridge, Gideon helped Mara down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, he said, for going tonight, for handling yourself with dignity despite everything they threw at you. You're stronger than you know. Before Mara could respond, he turned away to tend the horses. She went inside alone, climbing the stairs to her bedroom with a head full of confusion and a heart that didn't know whether to hope or guard itself against disappointment. The next morning brought Sunday, which meant the weekly communal meal. Mara threw herself into preparation, using cooking as a distraction from thoughts about the previous evening. She roasted chickens, baked bread, made gravy and potatoes and vegetables, producing enough food to feed the entire ranch crew with leftovers to spare. The men gathered at noon, filling the bunkhouse with noise and laughter. They attacked the food with their usual enthusiasm, offering compliments between mouthfuls. Even Frank Delaney, who rarely praised anything, admitted the chicken was the best he'd ever tasted. Thomas found Mara in the kitchen afterward, helping with cleanup. The men wanted me to tell you something. What? That whatever happened in Dawson last night, and we've all heard the gossip that came back with the supply wagon this morning, doesn't change how we see you. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in years. We're lucky to have you. Mara felt her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. Thank you, Thomas. I mean it, and so does everyone else, even if they're too rough to say it proper. You belong here, Mrs. Vale. Don't let any fancy town folk tell you different. After he left, Mara stood in the kitchen and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from relief. Maybe she would never be beautiful. Maybe Dawson society would always judge her harshly. But at Iron Ridge, she mattered. Her work mattered. And slowly, tentatively, she was building a life that mattered too. That evening, Gideon found her in the garden pulling weeds by the last light of sunset. He stood at the garden's edge, watching her work. Can we talk? He asked. Mara sat back on her heels. Of course. He moved closer but didn't sit, remaining standing as if he needed the height for courage. I've been thinking about what you said last night, about never having what other couples have, and I realized something. What? I don't want our marriage to stay the way it is. Separate bedrooms, careful distance, everything kept practical and safe. He paused. I want more, if you do. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. What kind of more? I don't know exactly. I'm not good at this, at feelings and romantic words, but I know I like coming home to you. I like sitting on the porch together in the evenings. I like how you handle problems without falling apart, and how you stand up for yourself even when it's hard. I like who you are, Mara, not just what you do. You barely know who I am. Then let me learn. Let this marriage become something more than an arrangement. He finally crouched down to her level, his eyes serious. I can't promise I'll be good at it. I can't promise poetry or grand gestures, but I can promise I'll try, if you're willing to try too. Mara looked at this man who'd chosen her when no one else would, who defended her to society ladies and danced with her despite not knowing how, who was now offering something that sounded dangerously close to affection. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've been rejected too many times to easily believe someone might actually want me for more than what I can do." "I know, and I've been hurt too badly to easily risk caring again. But maybe we can be scared together. Maybe that's enough to start with." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise that love would develop, but it was honest and real and more than Mara had ever expected to have. "All right," she said quietly, "we can try." Gideon's expression softened into something that might have been relief or hope, or both. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both intimate and tentative. They sat together in the garden as full darkness fell, neither speaking but both holding on, two damaged people choosing to risk building something fragile and uncertain together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to the fairy tales Mara had dreamed about as a young girl. But it was real and honest and maybe, just maybe, strong enough to survive. The shift between them was subtle at first, barely noticeable in the daily rhythms of ranch life. But Mara felt it in small moments. The way Gideon's hand would brush hers when passing dishes at dinner, how he'd started lingering in the kitchen while she cooked instead of disappearing to his office, the quiet conversations on the porch that stretched longer into the evening. 3 weeks after the Dawson party, Mara woke to find the first snow of the season dusting the valley in white. She stood at her bedroom window watching it fall, beautiful and ominous. Winter on the frontier was something she'd heard about but never experienced, and the stories from the ranch hands had done nothing to ease her anxiety. Downstairs, she found Gideon already dressed and preparing to head out. His expression was grim. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Could be nothing. Could be the start of an early winter. Either way, we need to prepare." He gulped coffee, standing up. "I'm taking the men to move the cattle to lower pastures. We'll be gone most of the day, maybe into evening. Can you manage here?" "Of course. What do you need?" "Hot food ready when we get back. And if the snow gets heavier, make sure all the fires are stocked. The temperature is going to drop fast once the sun sets." He left without his usual goodbye, his mind already on the work ahead. Mara watched through the window as he gathered the men, their voices carrying across the yard in sharp bursts. Within 20 minutes, they'd ridden out, leaving the ranch strangely quiet. The snow continued falling throughout the morning, accumulating faster than Mara had expected. By noon, several inches covered the ground, and the wind had picked up, driving the flakes sideways. She kept busy preparing food, a massive pot of stew that could feed however many men returned, plus bread and coffee and anything else that would warm cold bodies. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified into something that looked genuinely dangerous. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the wind howled around the house like something alive and angry. Mara stoked fires in every room, checked supplies, and tried not to think about Gideon and the men somewhere out in this. Darkness fell early, swallowed by the storm. Mara stood at the window, straining to see any sign of returning riders, but there was nothing except white chaos. Fear crept up her spine. What if they couldn't find their way back? What if someone got separated from the group? What if Gideon... She forced the thoughts away and focused on practical matters. More wood for the fires, blankets laid out in case anyone needed them, medical supplies from the cabinet in case of injuries. Work kept panic at bay. At 7 o'clock, she heard shouting outside. Mara rushed to the door and pulled it open, immediately regretting it as snow and wind blasted into the house. Through the storm, she could barely make out shapes, men and horses moving toward the barn. She left the door open despite the cold, keeping a lamp lit as a beacon. Over the next 30 minutes, men stumbled into the bunkhouse or made their way to the main house, all of them snow-covered and shaking with cold. Mara directed them to fires and hot coffee, counting heads anxiously. Thomas was the last one in. His face was red with cold, ice crusting his beard. "Everyone accounted for?" Mara asked. "All except the boss. He sent us ahead while he checked on a section of fence that looked weak. Said he'd be right behind us." Mara's stomach dropped. "When?" "Hour ago, maybe longer. Visibility's so bad out there, he might have gotten turned around." An hour. Gideon had been out in this storm alone for an hour. Mara thought about the vast darkness, the blinding snow, how easy it would be to lose direction and wander into nothing. "We need to go look for him." Thomas shook his head. "Too dangerous." Best thing we can do is keep fires burning and hope he finds his way back. If we send men out, we risk losing more people. You can't just leave him out there. Mrs. Vale, Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. The boss knows this land better than anyone. If anyone can survive out there, it's him. But if we go out blind in this storm, we're more likely to cause problems than solve them. Mara wanted to argue, but she could see the exhaustion and worry in Thomas's face. He was right. Sending more men into the storm would be foolish. But the thought of Gideon alone in that freezing darkness made her chest constrict with fear. She returned to the main house and kept watch at the window, periodically opening the door to shout into the storm, despite knowing it was probably useless. The wind stole her voice before it could carry more than a few feet. 8 o'clock passed. Then 9. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Mara paced the house, checking fires and windows and the door, her fear growing with each passing minute. She'd been married to Gideon for 3 months. They'd just started building something tentative and fragile between them. The possibility of losing him now, before they'd figured out what that something might become, was unbearable. At 9:30 she heard it, a faint sound that might have been a shout or might have been wind. Mara threw open the door and peered into the storm. Nothing. She was about to close it when she heard it again, definitely a voice this time. "Gideon!" she screamed into the storm. "Gideon, can you hear me?" A shape materialized out of the white chaos. A man on horseback, moving slowly, the horse clearly exhausted. Relief flooded through Mara so intensely she felt dizzy. Gideon dismounted clumsily, nearly falling. Mara rushed out without thinking, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. She grabbed his arm and hauled him toward the house, while his horse followed instinctively toward the barn. Inside, she could finally see him properly. His lips were blue, his face dangerously pale, ice coating his beard and eyebrows. He was shaking so hard he could barely stand. "Bathroom," Mara ordered. "We need to get you warm." She half dragged him up the stairs, her heart pounding. She'd heard about what extreme cold could do: frostbite, hypothermia, death. Gideon's condition terrified her. In the bathroom, she started filling the tub with lukewarm water. Too hot would be dangerous, she remembered hearing somewhere. Gideon tried to help remove his clothes, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate, still clumsy with cold. "Let me," Mara said, pushing his hands away. She worked quickly, peeling off layers of frozen clothing until he stood shivering in just his undergarments. "Get in the tub." He obeyed without argument, sinking into the water with a groan. Mara could see his skin was mottled red and white in places, his fingers and toes worryingly pale. "What happened?" she asked, grabbing towels and blankets. "Got turned around," Gideon managed through chattering teeth. "Couldn't see anything. Horse finally found the way." "You could have died." "Probably." He was starting to shake less violently as the water warmed him. "Sorry, didn't mean to worry you." "Worry me?" Mara's voice came out sharper than intended. "You've been gone for hours in a blizzard. I thought—" She stopped, not wanting to say what she'd thought. What terrifying scenarios had played through her mind? Gideon's eyes focused on her face, clear now. "You were scared." "Of course I was scared. You're my—" She stopped again, not sure how to finish that sentence. Husband seemed too formal, partner too casual. Something she was starting to care about too much felt too vulnerable to say aloud. "I'm your what?" "You're important. To the ranch. To everyone here. We need you." The words felt inadequate, a coward's retreat from what she actually meant. But Gideon seemed to understand anyway. His expression softened. "I need you too. Kept thinking about that out there in the storm. How I'd made a promise to try, and I'd be damned if I broke it by freezing to death before we figured out what we were building." The raw honesty in his voice made Mara's eyes burn. She busied herself adding more warm water to the tub, not trusting herself to speak. Over the next hour, Gideon slowly recovered. The shaking subsided, color returned to his face, and his fingers regained their coordination. Mara helped him into dry clothes and settled him in front of the fireplace downstairs with blankets and hot coffee. "You should eat," she said. "Not hungry, just tired. You're eating anyway. You need to rebuild your strength." She brought him a bowl of stew and stood over him until he'd finished most of it. Only when she was satisfied he was truly recovering did she allow herself to relax slightly. They sat in front of the fire, the storm still raging outside, but feeling less threatening now that Gideon was safe. The house creaked and groaned against the wind, but inside it was warm and quiet. "Thank you," Gideon said finally, "for taking care of me. What else would I do? Let you freeze?" "Some people might have. My first wife probably would have panicked and made everything worse." He stared into the fire. "But you just handled it. Knew exactly what to do." "I've had practice handling emergencies. You learn to stay calm when panic doesn't help." Gideon turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I mean it, Mara. Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For being stronger than I probably deserve." "You deserve plenty." "Do I? I haven't exactly been a model husband. Separate bedrooms, emotional distance, treating our marriage like a business arrangement for months, while you did all the hard work of making this house feel like a home." Mara pulled her shawl tighter. "We both agreed to those terms. Doesn't mean they were good terms. Doesn't mean I shouldn't try harder to give you what you deserve." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers still cold but steady now. "I've been thinking a lot since Dawson, about what you said, about never having what other couples have, and I realized I want you to have that. Want us to have it." "Gideon, let me finish. I know I'm not good at this. Not good at talking about feelings or being vulnerable, but sitting out there in the storm, not knowing if I'd make it back, all I could think about was how stupid I'd been to keep you at arm's length when you're the best thing that's happened to me in years." Mara's throat felt tight. "You were half frozen. You probably weren't thinking clearly. I was thinking perfectly clearly, clearer than I have in months." His grip on her hand tightened. "I care about you, Mara. Not just because you're competent or tough or good at running the ranch, because you're you. Because coming home to you makes everything else worthwhile. Because the thought of losing you tonight terrified me in a way nothing else has since my wife died." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Mara thought she understood about their relationship. She'd been prepared for practical partnership, for respect without affection. She hadn't prepared for this, for Gideon looking at her like she mattered beyond her utility. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Needed to be honest about where I'm at." He paused. "Though I wouldn't object if you told me how you felt." Mara looked at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers worn from work. "I'm scared. I've spent my whole life protecting myself from wanting things I couldn't have. And this, what you're offering, feels like the most dangerous thing I could want." "Why dangerous?" "Because I could start believing it. Could start thinking I deserve to be cared about for more than what I can do. And then, if you changed your mind, if you realized you'd made a mistake," her voice cracked, "it would destroy me, Gideon. Being rejected by 7 strangers was hard enough. Being rejected by you, after starting to believe this might be real, would be unbearable." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he shifted closer, until their shoulders were touching. "I can't promise I'll never hurt you. I'm bound to mess up, say the wrong thing, be too blunt when I should be gentle. But I can promise I won't reject you. Won't wake up one day and decide you're not good enough. You are good enough, Mara. More than good enough." "How do you know?" "Because I've watched you for 3 months. Watched you handle every challenge without complaining. Watched you win over men who didn't want to accept you. Watched you face down society ladies who tried to crush you. You're the strongest person I know. That doesn't change based on my mood or the weather or anything else." The certainty in his voice made something crack open in Mara's chest. She'd spent so long being told she wasn't enough, not pretty enough, not small enough, not worthy enough. Hearing Gideon say the opposite with such conviction felt like discovering solid ground after years of quicksand. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "More than I thought I would, more than is probably safe. Then we're both taking a risk. Maybe that's how this works. Both of us being brave enough to try despite our fears." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the valley. But inside, Mara and Gideon sat close together, hands linked, something fragile and important building between them. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, Iron Ridge became its own isolated world, cut off from everything beyond the valley by walls of white. The men stayed in the bunkhouse, venturing out only to tend animals and check fences. Mara and Gideon were trapped in the main house together, forced into a proximity they'd carefully avoided since their marriage. But instead of awkward, it felt almost comfortable. They developed routines, cooking together, sitting by the fire, talking about things deeper than ranch business. Gideon told her about his childhood, about his father's failures and his own determination to succeed. Mara shared stories about her family, about feeling invisible in her own home, about the desperation that had driven her west 8 times seeking acceptance. On the third night, as the storm finally began to weaken, they sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, wrapped in blankets. Gideon had moved closer over the past few days, the physical distance between them shrinking naturally. "Can I ask you something personal?" Mara said. "Go ahead." "You mentioned your first wife died in childbirth. Do you still want children?" Gideon was quiet for so long Mara thought he wouldn't answer. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I'm too old, too scarred by what happened. But another part wonders what it would be like to raise a child differently than I was raised, to give them stability and security instead of poverty and uncertainty. And with me? Would you want children with me?" He turned to look at her fully. "Is that something you want?" "I never let myself think about it before. Women like me don't usually get married, so children seemed impossible. But now," she trailed off, not sure how to articulate the complicated feelings, "I think I'd like it if we decided we were ready. Then maybe someday. Not now. We're still figuring out what we are to each other. But someday, if we both want it, we could try." His expression turned serious. "But I need you to know, if anything happened to you the way it happened to my first wife, I don't think I'd survive it. So if we ever do try for children, we do it carefully, with a doctor present, with every precaution possible. Your safety matters more than any potential child." The fierceness in his voice surprised her. "You really mean that?" "I've already lost one wife. I can't lose another. Especially not you." "Why especially me?" "Because she was someone I chose impulsively, based on attraction and youthful stupidity. You're someone I chose deliberately, and who's become more important than I knew how to expect." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture tender in a way that made Mara's breath catch. "You matter, Mara, in ways I'm still figuring out how to articulate." She leaned into his touch without thinking, and suddenly they were closer than they'd ever been. Gideon's hand moved from her hair to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. His eyes searched hers, asking a question without words. Mara answered by closing the distance between them. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, but then Gideon's other hand came up to frame her face, and Mara's hands gripped his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like promise and possibility and the beginning of something real. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that weeks ago," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was scared. Because I didn't want to pressure you. Because I wasn't sure if you'd want me to." He pulled back enough to see her face. "Was it all right that I kissed you?" "It was more than all right." Mara felt heat creep up her neck. "I've been wondering what it would be like if we'd ever get past being polite strangers who happen to be married." "Something like that." Gideon smiled, a real smile, not the careful half-expressions he usually allowed himself. "I think we just did." They stayed up late that night, talking and occasionally kissing, the storm outside finally dying to nothing. When they eventually climbed the stairs to their separate bedrooms, Gideon paused at his door. "This feels ridiculous," he said, "having separate rooms when we both want to be together." Mara's heart raced. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing tonight. You're not ready, and I'm not going to rush you. But soon, when you feel comfortable, I'd like you to move into my room, or I'll move into yours, whichever you prefer." "Why not yours? It's larger." "Then mine it is. But only when you're ready. No pressure." He kissed her forehead and disappeared into his room, leaving Mara standing in the hallway with her heart pounding and her mind spinning. This was happening. They were becoming a real married couple, not just partners sharing space. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. A week later, Mara moved her belongings across the hall. It took all of 20 minutes since she owned so little, but the emotional weight of the action felt enormous. That night, she lay in Gideon's bed, their bed now, while he held her with careful tenderness. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Nervous, but good nervous, I think." We can still go back to separate rooms if you'd be more comfortable. No, I don't want that. I just need time to believe this is real, that you actually want me here. Gideon tightened his arms around her. I want you here. In this bed, in this house, in my life. I'm not good at romantic speeches, but that's the truth. That's all I need. Just the truth. They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other, both taking a leap of faith that the other would catch them. The weeks that followed brought a deepening between them that Mara hadn't known was possible. Gideon became more openly affectionate, taking her hand during meals, kissing her goodbye when leaving for work, pulling her close on the porch in the evenings. Small gestures that meant everything because they were freely given rather than obligated. The ranch hands noticed the change and seemed pleased by it. Even Frank Delaney stopped making snide comments, though he never became friendly. Thomas pulled Mara aside one day to tell her the men were glad to see the boss happy again. He's been grieving longer than anyone realized, Thomas said. Not just for his wife, but for the idea of having a real partnership. You've given him that. We're grateful. The gratitude felt strange, like she was being thanked for something she wanted anyway, but she appreciated the sentiment. Winter deepened, bringing more storms and harder work, but Mara found she didn't mind the challenges. She'd been tested by frontier life and discovered she was strong enough to survive it. More than survive. Thrive. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire, Gideon pulled a small box from his pocket. What's that? Mara asked. Something I should have given you months ago. He opened the box to reveal a ring, sapphire set in silver, beautiful but not ostentatious. I know we're already married, but everything about our marriage has been backwards. We got married before we courted, lived together before we knew each other, signed contracts before we had feelings. I wanted to do at least one thing in the right order. He slid off the sofa and knelt in front of her, suddenly looking nervous in a way Mara had never seen. Mara Vale, will you marry me? Actually marry me this time, not as a business arrangement, but as partners who care about each other. As two people building a life together because they choose to, not because it's practical. Will you be my wife, not in contract but in heart? Mara felt tears slide down her face. We're already married. I know, but I want you to choose it. Choose me. Choose this life. Not because you had nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here. She looked at this man who'd seen past her body to everything else she offered, who'd given her a place to belong and was now offering something even more precious, the choice to belong not from necessity, but from desire. Yes, she said through tears. Yes, I choose you. I choose this. I choose us. Gideon slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like he'd somehow known her size, and then pulled her into a kiss that tasted like salt and promise. When they finally broke apart, Mara looked at the ring catching firelight. When did you get this? Ordered it from Dawson 6 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right moment. This was it. This was perfect. They held each other in front of the fire, the ring heavy and real on Mara's finger, proof that this imperfect, backwards, practical marriage had somehow transformed into something neither of them had expected, actual love, hard-won and honestly earned. Outside, snow fell softly over Iron Ridge, blanketing the valley in quiet white. Inside, Mara and Gideon made plans for a future that felt suddenly full of possibility. They talked about spring planting, about possibly hiring help so Mara wasn't working herself to exhaustion, about the children they might have someday when they were ready. It wasn't perfect. They still argued occasionally, still frustrated each other, still had to navigate the complications of two strong-willed people learning to share a life. But it was real and honest and built on a foundation strong enough to last. Later that night, lying in bed with Gideon's arms around her, Mara thought about the 7 bride platforms where she'd stood unwanted. Thought about believing she would never be chosen, never be valued for more than what she could do. She'd been wrong. Not about how cruel the world could be, that cruelty was real and ongoing, but about her own worth. About the possibility that someone might see past surface judgments to the person underneath. Gideon stirred beside her. You're thinking too loud, he mumbled. Sorry, just grateful. For what? For you, for this, for Iron Ridge and second chances and backwards marriages that somehow work out anyway. He pulled her closer, his voice rough with sleep. I'm the grateful one. You saved me, Mara, from loneliness and grief and giving up on ever finding real partnership. You're the best choice I ever made. Even though I'm not, don't, his voice sharpened. Don't finish that sentence. You're beautiful to me. Your strength, your capability, your stubborn refusal to let the world break you, that's beautiful. Everything else is just decoration. Mara pressed her face against his chest, overwhelmed by the fierce certainty in his voice. Maybe she'd never be beautiful by society's standards. Maybe Dawson ladies would always judge her harshly. But here, in this bed, in this man's arms, she was valued for exactly who she was. And for the first time in her life, that felt like more than enough. Spring arrived late that year, the snow clinging stubbornly to the valley until March winds finally swept it away. Mara stood in the kitchen garden, working soil that had just thawed enough to accept seeds, when she heard hoofbeats approaching the house. She straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and saw a wagon coming up the road from town. It was Margaret Henderson from Dawson, her gray-streaked hair tied back practically, her face windburned from the journey. She climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of someone who'd been traveling for hours. "Mrs. Vale," Margaret called, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Mara wiped dirt from her hands. "What brings you all the way to Iron Ridge?" Margaret's expression turned serious. "A favor to ask, and a problem that needs solving. Can we talk?" Over coffee in the kitchen, Margaret explained. There were children throughout the territory. Ranch children, children of homesteaders, children living in isolated places too far from any town to attend school regularly. They were growing up without education, many of them barely able to read or write. "I've been trying to organize something," Margaret said. "A traveling teacher program maybe, or small schools at various ranches. But every time I propose it to the Territory Council, they dismiss it, say there's no money, no interest, no one willing to take on the responsibility." "What does this have to do with me? I heard about you from several sources. Thomas Webb's wife mentioned you were teaching young Jack Morrison to read in your spare time, and Sarah Cross, Samuel's wife, admitted you'd given her some advice about managing household accounts that she found helpful." Margaret set down her cup. "You're intelligent, capable, and you understand what it's like to be overlooked by people who should know better. These children need an advocate, someone willing to fight for them." Mara felt something stir in her chest, a sense of purpose beyond the daily rhythms of ranch management. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Start small. Open a school here at Iron Ridge for the children within riding distance. Prove it can work. Once we have a successful model, it'll be easier to convince the territory to fund more schools elsewhere." "I'm not a trained teacher. Neither were most of the women who taught me. They just knew more than their students and cared enough to share it." Margaret leaned forward. "You have the space, the resources, and the temperament. And from what I've seen, you're exactly the kind of woman who refuses to let obstacles stop her." After Margaret left, Mara stood on the porch thinking. A school would be substantial work on top of everything else she already managed. But the idea took root, growing stronger the more she considered it. How many children were growing up without opportunities, their potential wasted because no one thought education mattered enough to prioritize it? That evening, she brought it up with Gideon over dinner. "Margaret Henderson came by today." Gideon looked up from his plate. "About what?" Mara explained the proposal, watching his face for reactions. He listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. "What do you think?" she asked when she'd finished. "I think it's a lot of work, but I also think you'd be good at it." He set down his fork. "The real question is whether you want to do it. You're already managing a household and feeding 30 men, adding teaching responsibilities on top of that. I know it's a lot. But I keep thinking about those children, about how I felt growing up being told I wasn't worth investing in. If I can keep even a few kids from feeling that way." She trailed off, not sure how to articulate the pull she felt. Gideon reached across the table and took her hand. "Then do it. We'll figure out how to make it work. Maybe hire someone to help with the household management so you're not stretched too thin. Thomas's daughter might be interested. She's 16 and looking for work." "You'd really support this?" "Mara, you've spent the last 6 months proving you can handle anything you set your mind to. Why would I doubt you now?" He squeezed her hand. "Besides, I like seeing you passionate about something. You light up when you talk about it." The first challenge was space. The main house couldn't accommodate students. They needed their privacy, and children needed room to move. After surveying the ranch, Gideon suggested converting one of the unused outbuildings near the main house. It had been storage once, but with work, it could become a schoolroom. Thomas and several ranch hands spent 2 weeks transforming the building. They repaired the roof, replaced broken windows, built desks and benches from salvaged lumber. Mara painted the walls white to make the space brighter, installed a wood stove for heat, and organized supplies donated by families in the area. Word spread faster than expected. Within a month, Mara had commitments from 7 families, 14 children total, ranging in age from 6 to 15. Some would ride in daily from neighboring ranches. Others would board at Iron Ridge during the week, sleeping in a section of the bunkhouse Thomas's crew had partitioned off for the purpose. The night before school was set to start, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay awake beside Gideon, her mind racing with doubts. "What if I'm terrible at this?" she whispered. "You won't be." "How do you know?" "Because you care. That's more than half the battle." He pulled her closer. "And if you struggle, you'll figure it out. That's what you do. You solve problems." "What if the parents decide I'm not good enough? What if they pull their children out? Then you'll have tried something brave and difficult, and that's still worth doing." He kissed her forehead. "Stop trying to imagine all the ways this could fail and get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day." The first morning of school arrived with clear skies and nervous energy. Children began arriving at 8 o'clock, some on horseback, others in wagons driven by parents who wanted to see this new school for themselves. Mara greeted each family at the door, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The youngest was Emma Carter, barely 6 years old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The oldest was Michael Fletcher, 15 and sullen about being forced to attend school when he'd rather be working. The rest fell somewhere in between, curious, anxious, excited, or resentful depending on their personalities and circumstances. Once all the children were seated, Mara stood at the front of the room and took a slow breath. "My name is Mrs. Vale," she began. "Some of you might have heard things about me, that I'm from back east, that I married Mr. Vale after being rejected by other men, that I'm fat and plain and not what people expected a rancher's wife to look like." The blunt words startled several children. Even young Emma looked surprised. "I'm telling you this," Mara continued, "because I want you to understand something important. What other people think about you, their judgments, their assumptions, their cruel comments, that doesn't define your worth. Your worth comes from who you are, what you can do, and how you treat others. I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't good enough. I'm done believing it, and I don't want any of you to waste years believing the same lies about yourselves." She paused, looking at each young face. "This school exists because someone decided you matter. Your education matters. Your future matters. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if your family is respected or looked down on, if you're pretty or plain or anything else. What matters is that you're here, ready to learn. And I'm here, ready to teach. That's enough." Michael Fletcher was watching her with something like respect. Even sullen teenagers responded to honesty. The first weeks were chaotic. Mara had students at vastly different levels. Some couldn't read at all. Others were already working through advanced texts. She divided them into groups, rotating her attention while assigning independent work to keep everyone occupied. It was exhausting and messy, and nothing like the orderly classrooms she'd imagined. But slowly, patterns emerged. She discovered Emma Carter was brilliant with numbers despite being unable to read yet. Michael Fletcher was surprisingly good at helping younger students once Mara gave him the responsibility. 2 siblings, the Harrison boys, constantly competed with each other but pushed each other to learn faster in the process. By the end of the first month, Mara had developed routines that worked. Mornings for reading and writing, afternoons for mathematics and practical skills. Once a week, Gideon would visit to talk about ranch management, teaching the older students about animal husbandry, land management, and business principles they'd need if they stayed in ranching. Parents began stopping by, initially skeptical but gradually warming as they saw their children's progress. Even families who'd been openly critical of Mara's marriage admitted their children were learning more than they'd expected. The real test came in late spring when Catherine Morris, the woman who'd insulted Mara at the Dawson party, brought her 8-year-old daughter Lucy to Iron Ridge. "I heard you were running a school," Catherine said stiffly, standing in Mara's kitchen. "My daughter needs education, and the school in Dawson is overcrowded. I'm here to see if your establishment is adequate." The condescension was thick enough to cut. Mara kept her voice level. "You're welcome to observe a lesson before deciding." Catherine did exactly that, sitting in the back of the schoolroom with a critical expression while Mara taught. She watched Mara work with students individually, saw how the children responded with enthusiasm rather than fear, noticed the genuine learning happening despite the simple surroundings. When the lesson ended, Catherine approached Mara with an expression that looked like it physically pained her. "I'd like to enroll Lucy. If you have space." "I have space." Mara met her eyes steadily. "But I need to know you understand something first. In this school, all students are treated with equal respect regardless of their background. That includes how parents speak to and about other families. If you can't manage basic civility, I'd rather you take Lucy elsewhere." Catherine's face reddened. "Are you seriously giving me conditions?" "Yes, because I won't let your daughter learn that cruelty is acceptable, and I won't let you undermine what I'm building here." For a long moment, Catherine just stared. Then, surprisingly, she nodded. "Fine. I'll keep my opinions to myself, but only because Lucy needs an education more than I need to point out how absurd it is that the territory's best school is being run by—" She stopped herself. "Never mind. When can she start?" Lucy started the following week and proved to be a bright, eager student. Catherine kept her promise about civility, though her tight-lipped expression whenever she picked up her daughter suggested the effort cost her. As summer arrived, the school's reputation spread. More families inquired about enrollment. Margaret Henderson visited again, bringing a representative from the Territory Council who wanted to see the school everyone was talking about. The representative, a stern man named Douglas Wright, spent a full day observing. Mara tried not to let his presence make her nervous as she taught, but she felt his scrutiny like weight on her shoulders. At the end of the day, Wright called Mara aside. "Mrs. Vale, I'll be honest. When Margaret first proposed funding education for isolated children, I thought it was a waste of resources. I didn't believe there was sufficient interest or that anyone could effectively teach such a diverse group." Mara braced herself for criticism. "I was wrong," Wright continued. "What you've built here is impressive. These children are learning at levels that rival or exceed students in established schools, and you're doing it with minimal resources and no formal training. Thank you, but I'm recommending the territory provide funding for 3 more schools modeled on yours. We'll need teachers willing to take on the challenge. Would you be willing to train them? Share your methods?" The request caught Mara completely off guard. "I'm not an expert. I've only been doing this for 3 months. Which makes you more of an expert than anyone else in the territory. Think about it. We'll formalize the proposal in the next council meeting." After Wright left, Mara stood in the empty schoolroom feeling overwhelmed. She'd started this to help a handful of children. Now she might be shaping education policy for the entire territory. That evening, she told Gideon about Wright's visit while they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the valley in gold and orange. "You're going to say yes," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know. Training other teachers, influencing policy, that's bigger than I ever intended. But it's what needs doing, and you're the person to do it." "How can you be so sure?" Gideon turned to look at her fully. "Because you're the woman who stood on 8 bride platforms and kept trying. Who moved to an isolated ranch and made it thrive. Who faced down society ladies and started a school despite having no experience. You don't back down from challenges, Mara. You never have." She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What if I fail?" "Then you fail trying something important. But I don't think you will. I think you're going to change this territory in ways neither of us can predict yet." By midsummer, Mara had agreed to train 2 new teachers, both women, both from backgrounds similar to hers. One was a widow in her 40s who'd been told she was too old to be useful. The other was a young woman with a pronounced limp who'd been rejected from teaching positions elsewhere because schools worried she'd frighten children. Mara worked with them through August, sharing everything she'd learned through trial and error. She taught them how to manage students at different levels, how to handle difficult parents, how to make learning engaging despite limited resources. Both women proved capable and eager. In September, they opened schools at 2 other large ranches in the territory. By October, a 3rd school opened near Dawson. The Territory Council formally recognized the program, allocating funds for supplies and teacher salaries. Word reached Mara that people in Dawson were calling her schools Vale's Education Initiative, though she'd never given them an official name. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she couldn't deny the pride that came with seeing her idea spread and succeed. The second winter at Iron Ridge was easier than the first. Mara knew what to expect now: the isolation, the relentless cold, the work required to keep everyone safe and fed. But this time she wasn't facing it alone. She had Gideon beside her, true partnership replacing careful distance. She had students who kept coming even through snow, their parents committed to education despite the hardship. She had purpose beyond survival. One evening in January, Gideon brought up a subject they'd been dancing around for months. "I've been thinking about children again." Mara set down her sewing. And I think I'm ready. If you are." He looked nervous in a way that made Mara's heart squeeze. "I know there are risks, but I also know I want a family with you. Want to build something that lasts beyond just the two of us." "I want that too," Mara admitted. "But I'm scared. Your first wife." "I know, but we'll be careful. We'll plan it properly. Make sure we have a doctor available, that you're not working yourself to exhaustion, that everything possible is done to keep you safe." He took her hands. "I can't promise nothing will go wrong, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to protect you." "What if I can't have children? I'm 33. That's not young for starting a family." "Then we adopt. Or we don't have children at all. And we're still a complete family. Having children would be wonderful, but having you is essential. I won't risk you for anything." They decided to try, but carefully. Mara scaled back her teaching responsibilities, training an assistant to handle some of the daily work. She hired Thomas's daughter full-time to manage the household, freeing herself from the most physically demanding tasks. Gideon insisted she rest more, worry less, and let others carry some of the weight she'd been bearing alone. By March, Mara suspected she might be pregnant. By April, she was certain. The realization brought equal parts joy and terror. Gideon hired a doctor from Dawson to examine her. Dr. Patricia Williams was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd delivered hundreds of babies and didn't believe in coddling her patients. "You're healthy," she told Mara after the examination. "Good weight, strong constitution, no obvious problems. Your age is a factor, but not an insurmountable one. Follow my instructions. Don't do anything stupid, and there's no reason to expect complications." "What if something goes wrong anyway?" Dr. Williams' expression softened slightly. "Then we handle it. But spending 9 months worrying about what might happen is pointless. Focus on what you can control: eating well, resting adequately, staying active but not overworking. Leave the worrying to your husband. He's already doing enough of it for both of you." She was right about that. Gideon became almost comically protective, hovering whenever Mara stood for too long, insisting she stop teaching by her 6th month despite her protests, personally screening every visitor to make sure they weren't sick. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Mara told him after he'd forbidden her from lifting anything heavier than a book. "I know, but I can't help being careful." "There's careful, and there's treating me like I'm made of glass." "Would you prefer I not care?" "No, I just need you to trust that I know my own body and limitations." It was their first real argument as a married couple. They didn't speak for several hours, both stubborn and both scared for different reasons. Finally, Gideon found Mara in the garden despite her being technically banned from gardening. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right. I've been suffocating you because I'm terrified of losing you. And I've been pushing back because I don't want to be weak or helpless." Mara set down her trowel. "We're both scared, but we need to trust each other. Trust that I'll ask for help when I need it, and trust that you'll listen when I tell you I'm fine." "I can do that, but you have to promise you'll actually ask for help instead of trying to handle everything yourself." "Deal." They found a middle ground after that, Mara accepting help when genuinely needed, Gideon backing off when his protectiveness crossed into control. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The pregnancy progressed without major complications. Mara's body changed in ways that were both fascinating and uncomfortable. Her students adapted to having a visibly pregnant teacher, with the younger children especially delighted by the prospect of Mrs. Vale's baby. Only Catherine Morris made snide comments, whispering to other parents about the impropriety of having a pregnant woman teaching their children. But by then, Mara had earned enough respect that most parents dismissed Catherine's complaints as petty jealousy. In late November, 2 weeks before her due date, Mara went into labor. Dr. Williams had been staying at Iron Ridge for the past month specifically for this moment. She took over with calm efficiency, directing Gideon and Thomas's wife Hannah in how to help. The labor lasted 18 hours, long and painful but not complicated. Gideon stayed by Mara's side the entire time despite Dr. Williams's suggestion that he wait elsewhere. He held Mara's hand through contractions, wiped her face with cool cloths, and whispered encouragement even when she cursed at him. Finally, as dawn broke over the valley, their daughter was born. She emerged screaming and healthy, with a full head of dark hair and her father's strong features. "She's perfect," Dr. Williams announced, placing the baby in Mara's arms. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that clearly work fine. Congratulations. Gideon stared at the baby with an expression of pure wonder. "We have a daughter." "We have a daughter," Mara echoed, still not quite believing it. They named her Sarah Grace. Sarah after no one in particular, just because they liked it, and Grace because it felt like grace that had brought them together. Grace that had transformed a practical arrangement into genuine love. Grace that had allowed them both to survive enough hurt to find each other. The first months of parenthood were exhausting. Sarah was a colicky baby who cried frequently and slept poorly. Mara and Gideon took turns walking the floor with her, both of them bleary-eyed and stumbling through days on minimal sleep. But there was joy, too, watching Sarah's first smile, seeing Gideon's hard face soften completely when he held his daughter. The way the ranch hands competed to hold the baby during meals, these rough men becoming gentle with something so small and precious. Mara's school continued operating with her assistant teacher, handling daily lessons while Mara focused on recovery and motherhood. She returned to teaching part-time when Sarah was 4 months old, bringing the baby with her. Students took turns helping watch Sarah during lessons, learning responsibility while Mara worked. By Sarah's first birthday, 3 more schools had opened in the territory. Mara had trained 7 teachers total, all women who'd been overlooked or dismissed by traditional schools. The program was being discussed as a model for other territories facing similar challenges with isolated populations. Margaret Henderson visited on Sarah's birthday, bringing a cake and a proposal. "The Territory Council wants to make this official," Margaret explained. "Create a formal education department with you as director. You'd oversee all the schools, train new teachers, and help develop curriculum standards. That's a significant responsibility. You've already been doing most of it informally. This would just give you authority to make actual policy decisions and a salary to match the work." Mara looked at Sarah playing on a blanket nearby, then at Gideon, who was watching her with quiet support. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but Mara, you've built something remarkable here, something that's changing children's lives. Don't underestimate the importance of that." After Margaret left, Mara sat with Gideon on the porch while Sarah napped inside. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think you've already decided. You just need to convince yourself you deserve it." "Do I?" "Deserve it, I mean. I'm not formally educated. I stumbled into teaching by accident. There are probably more qualified people." "Stop." Gideon's voice was firm. "You're the most qualified person because you've done the work. You've proven these schools work. You've trained teachers who are succeeding. You understand the challenges because you've lived them." He took her hand. "The question isn't whether you deserve this opportunity. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept it." Mara thought about the woman who'd stood on 8 bride platforms, the woman who'd married a stranger and moved to an isolated ranch, the woman who'd started a school with no experience and somehow made it succeed. That woman had been brave enough to try impossible things. Maybe she was still that woman. "I'll do it," she said. The acceptance transformed Mara's life yet again. She became a public figure in ways she'd never anticipated, testifying before the Territory Council, speaking at education conferences, training teachers from other territories who came to observe her methods. It was overwhelming and occasionally terrifying, but also deeply satisfying. She learned to ignore the whispers that still followed her, about her appearance, about being unqualified, about somehow fooling everyone into thinking she was competent. The whispers didn't disappear, but they mattered less. Her work spoke louder than any criticism. Years passed. Sarah grew into a bright, confident child who loved books and horses equally. Mara and Gideon had 2 more children, a son named Thomas and another daughter named Emma. The main house filled with noise and chaos and life. Iron Ridge continued thriving under their partnership. Gideon expanded the ranch, purchasing adjacent land as it became available. Mara's education program grew to include 20 schools across the territory, serving hundreds of children who would have otherwise grown up without formal education. On their 10th anniversary, Gideon took Mara back to Red Hollow. They rode together on horseback, leaving the children in Hannah's capable care for a few days. The town had grown since Mara first arrived. More buildings, more people, more prosperity. But the bride platform still stood at the edge of town, weathered and quiet. Mara dismounted and walked onto the platform, remembering the woman she'd been. 32 years old, desperate, certain she'd never be chosen. She'd stood here believing her life was essentially over, that she'd exhausted all possibilities. Gideon joined her, standing close. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing me instead of going home?" "Never." Mara looked at him. This man who'd seen value where everyone else saw nothing, who'd given her space to become more than she'd thought possible. "You gave me a life I couldn't have imagined, a home, a purpose, a family. Why would I regret that?" "Because it was hard. Because I wasn't always good at showing you how much you mattered. Because you could have found someone better. There wasn't anyone better. Not for me." She took his hand. "You chose me when I'd given up on being chosen. Everything else built from that." They stood together on the platform where their story had begun, 10 years and a lifetime of changes between then and now. Later, they visited Mrs. Colbert's boarding house. The older woman was retired now, the boarding house run by someone else, but she still lived in town and greeted Mara with genuine warmth. "Look at you," Mrs. Colbert said, studying Mara's face. "Happy. That's what I see. Genuinely happy." "I am." "And that husband of yours? Still treating you right?" "Better than right. He treats me like I matter." Mrs. Colbert smiled. "That's all anyone really needs, to matter to someone. Everything else is just decoration." As they prepared to leave Red Hollow, Mara took one last look at the bride platform. She thought about all the women who'd stood there over the years, some finding happiness, others finding heartbreak, all of them hoping for something better than what they'd left behind. She hoped they all found what they needed, hoped they all discovered, as she had, that worth wasn't measured by appearance or by other people's judgments, that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless, that sometimes the most practical arrangements could transform into the most profound love. The ride back to Iron Ridge took hours, but Mara didn't mind. The land stretched vast and beautiful around them, and at the end of the journey waited a house full of children and purpose and belonging. When they crested the final ridge and the valley opened below them, Mara saw her life spread out like a promise kept. The main house with smoke rising from its chimney, the school building where tomorrow she'd train another new teacher, the barns and pastures and fences that marked boundaries of home. This was hers, not because she was beautiful or young or what anyone expected, but because she'd been brave enough to keep trying after 7 rejections, because she'd chosen to believe she deserved more than just survival, because she'd built something real from nothing but stubborn determination and honest work. Gideon reached over and squeezed her hand. "Ready to go home?" "More than ready." They rode down into the valley together as sunset painted the sky crimson and gold. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal. Ahead, lights began appearing in windows, her children waiting, her life waiting, everything she'd earned through courage and persistence waiting. Mara Holloway Vale had been told her entire life that she took up too much space, that women like her should shrink themselves, apologize for existing, accept whatever scraps of acceptance came their way. She'd proven them all wrong. Had built a life large enough to match the size of her courage. Had transformed rejection into purpose and loneliness into love. Had taken up exactly as much space as she needed and refused to apologize for any of it. And in doing so, she'd taught an entire territory that worth was never measured by appearance, that the women society overlooked might be exactly the ones capable of changing the world, that love built on respect and honesty was stronger than anything built on beauty alone. The story of the fat bride who was chosen 8th had become the story of the woman who shaped frontier education. The story of someone dismissed had become the story of someone essential. Mara had finally found what she'd been searching for across 8 bride platforms and a lifetime of rejection, not just acceptance, but belonging, not just survival, but purpose, not just a place to exist, but a life worth living. And that, she thought, as Iron Ridge welcomed them home with lamplight and laughter and the messy beauty of family, was more than enough. It was everything.